Welcome, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, whether resting beneath the hush of blankets, watching rain roll down a window, or simply let your thoughts drift far from the day's weight. I'm so grateful you joined us. There's nothing left to rush for, no screens to chase, no noise to hold on to, just stillness and story. Tonight, we slip gently into the distant fog of the 14th century, to a time when the sky would not stop raining, and the earth forgot how to feed its people. This is not a tale of kings or conquests. It is quieter than that. It is a story of empty fields and hollow bellies, of mothers who counted seeds like prayers, of hands that searched for food in soil that would not give, and of what hunger truly meant, not just for the body, but for the soul. This is a long silence of the Great Famine of 1315, the forgotten reality of those who endured it, and the quiet, brutal truth about what happens when even the simplest human need to eat is taken away. So let yourself slow down now, let your breath steady, and follow me back into the cold, wet, waiting world of famine. This is the brutal reality of food in the Great Famine of 1315. It did not begin with fire or famine, nor with plague or panic, but with something quieter, something that crept beneath the skin of the season and unsettled it before anyone truly noticed. The spring, which in most years came reluctantly but faithfully, seemed this time to hesitate altogether, as though unsure of its place in the cycle of things. Snowmelt did not reveal the tender shoots of green that usually greeted the end of winter's grip. Instead, it exposed mud dark, sodden, and strangely still. The air, too, was different, heavier, thick with a damp chill that clung to wool and bone alike. Rain fell not in storms or bursts, but in a long, whispering mist that blurred the edges of the days and soaked the soil so thoroughly that even the most optimistic of farmers could not coax hope from it. In villages scattered across the countryside, where fields were not just part of the land but part of the language, where each patch of earth had a name and a history and a temperament, the change came quietly but unmistakably. The farmers, hardened by years of coaxing stubborn crops from reluctant ground, began their spring as they always had, with furrowed brows and calloused hands, pushing plows through muck, their feet dragging through trenches more water than soil. The seeds, once planted, should have taken root within weeks, their first green promises piercing the surface like sighs of relief after the silence of winter. But this year, there were no such promises. The furrows remained bare, week after week, as if the earth had forgotten its part in the bargain. Those who had lived long, whose faces bore the wrinkles of many harvests, both good and cruel, sensed something was off long before words were shared about it. They spoke quietly in corners, in kitchens, and in churches, their voices low not out of secrecy but out of uncertainty, as though naming the worry too soon might somehow make it worse. Too much rain, they muttered. No light in the mornings. No heat in the ground. Some pointed to the skies, overcast and unchanging, and claimed it was a punishment for pride, a reminder that man did not own the seasons but only borrowed them. Others simply looked down at their worn boots and said nothing at all. Inside the homes, where fires burned low and the smell of damp would linger even after the hearth was stoked, changes began in the smallest of ways. Meals, though still warm, began to thin. The bread was sliced more carefully. The stew was diluted with water drawn from wells that tasted faintly of iron. What little stores remained in the previous year's harvest were guarded quietly, with eyes that linger a moment too long on sacks of oats and wheels of hard cheese. It was not yet hunger, not quite, but it was a scent of it, like a wind that arrives before the storm, cold and tasting of iron and earth. The livestock, too, seemed uneasy. Chickens laid less frequently, their clucks less lively, their feathers dull. The cows stood in their pens with a restlessness that no amount of brushing could ease, and the pigs rooted through mud that offered nothing back. In the mornings, when the sun should have cast long golden rays over frost-tipped fields, the light arrived late, gray and weary, and lingered without warmth before retreating again behind another veil of cloud. Time itself seemed to stretch, not because it was too much of it, but because it refused to move forward, caught in the damp stillness of a season that would not shift. And still the rain fell, not violently, not dramatically, just endlessly, a constant whisper on thatch and stone, filling barrels and flooding furrows, turning roads to slow-moving rivers of mud and memory. Those who lived near rivers watched them swell with quiet dread, knowing that swollen banks meant drowned crops and spoiled seed. Even the sound of footsteps changed, no longer a crunch on drying soil, but a soft, wet slosh that followed them everywhere, a reminder that the ground itself had turned against them. Children, who understood the world less through language and more through routine, felt it too. Their play became more subdued. Their laughter, usually bright and irreverent, now floated to the village in shorter bursts, quickly swallowed by the heavy air. They asked more often when bread would be baked again, when the goats would give milk again, when the rains would stop. Their mothers, many of whom had grown up through hard seasons themselves, answered with vague reassurances that even they did not quite believe. The priests, whose sermons were typically filled with fire and certainty, began to speak in quieter tones. Some blamed sin, others urged patience. A few wept behind closed doors. At the altar, prayers grew longer and more desperate, not for wealth or peace, but simply for sun, for a break in clouds, for warmth in the soil, for the gentle miracle of the sprouting seed. But the skies did not part. The rain did not stop. And the ground, which once had been coaxed into life with song and sweat and sacrifice, now seemed indifferent to all of it. Spring had not arrived, and in its absence, something older, colder, and far less forgiving had taken its place. And yet, even in this long pause, life did not halt. People still rose in the mornings, still fed their animals what they could, still mended fences and prayed over fields, still boiled roots and wore thin shoes and washed hands that smelled of earth. But beneath each ordinary act was a growing tension, a question that no one dared ask out loud. What happens if the seeds do not grow? And when that question finally began to answer itself, it did so not with thunder, but with silence. A silence that settled like mist across the land. A silence that would deepen, darken, and slowly consume the villages one by one, until even the smallest, most hopeful harvest became a memory shared in hushed tones by fires that burned too low to chase away the cold. The silence, at first soft and temporary, began to settle into something more permanent, like mist that had forgotten how to lift. Fields that should have been tinged with the soft green of new life instead lay open and bare, their furrows filling with rainwater, their seed beds sinking into swamp-like patches that no spade could rescue. Men stood in these fields each morning, boots squelching in mud that reached the ankles, staring at the ground as though willing it to change by presence alone. Some knelt, pressing fingers into the soil, lifting it to the light and rubbing it between thumb and forefinger, searching for signs of drainage, of drying, of any texture that might suggest life was still possible. But the earth, like the sky above it, offered no promise. The seeds had been planted, yes, but they had not answered the call of spring. They had disappeared into the sodden earth, like prayers whispered into water. Weeks passed, and still no shoots emerged. The usual bright stems of barley, the first promise of rye, the soft reach of pea tendrils, none rose to greet the gray daylight. The fields lay still, glistening with damp, reflecting the flat sky like shallow mirrors. The farmers, who knew their land as intimately as one knows the face of a loved one, began to speak of it as if it had gone ill, as if the land itself had caught some sickness, a wet fever that would not break. They adjusted their sowing schedules, hoping that a few days of unexpected sun might turn the tide. But the sun, elusive and pale when it did appear, offered little warmth, as though it too had forgotten how to do its part. There were no easy solutions. The options were few. Seeds once sown could not be reclaimed. There was no way to start over. These were not wealthy farmers with vast stores of surplus grain. These were men and women who scraped together enough each year to survive, hoping always that next year would be kinder. The seed they had buried in the ground, barley, oats, beans, rye, was not just the start of the next harvest. It was the end of the last one, saved from hunger by patience and planning. There was no second sack, no backup, no secret store. If the seeds did not grow, the food would not come. And if the food did not come, there would be nothing to carry them through the next winter. In the early mornings, before the full weight of the day settled on shoulders already tired, some walked to the edge of their land and simply stood in the silence. The bird song was thinner. The air smelled of rot and damp straw. From the ground rose the smell of decay, of things trying to live and failing. The mold, invisible but persistent, had begun to find its way into granaries and under thatch. Mushrooms appeared in places they had not before, soft white spots clinging to corners, silent and unwelcome reminders of how far the wetness had spread. Children began to ask questions, not with panic, but with a kind of watchful curiosity. They noticed their parents grew quieter at mealtimes, and that the porridge no longer stuck to their ribs the way it once did. They noticed that dried meat was thinner or missing altogether, and that their mothers stirred more water into every pot. Some noticed how their fathers now checked the field each evening, even after the day's work was done, walking it slowly, as though looking for something lost. When the questions came, will the wheat grow, or when will the barley come, the answers were soft, almost hopeful, and always wrong. The older villagers, those with long memories and even longer patience, began to speak of other bad years, drawing comparisons not to comfort, but to prepare. They talked of the year when hail came in July, or the year the frost never left the upper soil, or the time when the blight took the potatoes in 3 days. These stories were told not to frighten, but to remind. The land had betrayed them before, and still they had endured. But in private, even these elders admitted this felt different. This felt heavier. This felt like something longer than a season. The priests were among the first to suggest that the problem might not be entirely natural. From the pulpit, voices rose to speak of sin, of collective guilt, of the way a people stray too far from obedience and bring divine correction upon themselves. The rains, they said, were not only water from the sky, but a warning. Perhaps too many had grown proud. Perhaps the festivals had become indulgent. Perhaps the tides had grown thin. And so, people began to attend church more often, not because they had answers, but because they needed a place where questions could be asked aloud, even if no reply came. Superstition crept in where science had no foothold. Some blamed the women who lived alone at the edge of the woods, those who knew the names of herbs and kept cats for company. Others looked toward the traveling merchants, the ones who brought foreign goods in foreign tongues, and perhaps, it was said, foreign curses. A few whispered that perhaps a nobleman's grave had been disturbed or that a holy relic had been taken from its rightful place. In a time when nature failed, people turned to anything that still seemed capable of consequence. And yet, through it all, life continued. Oxen still pulled plows, though they moved through more water than soil. Tools were still mended. Roofs were still patched. Meals, however small, were still shared. But an invisible weight had settled over the village, an understanding that this year would not be like the last. It moved in quiet gestures. The way flour was measured more carefully, the way spoons scraped every last trace from bowls, the way a neighbor's pale face was watched out of the corner of one's eye. It was in the way people counted days not by the sun or the moon, but by how much was left in the pantry. When at last, a single green shoot did appear in one field near the edge of the marsh, a crowd gathered around it as though it were a miracle. The children were brought to see it. Prayers were murmured. Hands reached out to touch it, then paused, uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn, because one shoot meant nothing. One shoot could not feed a village. And worse, one shoot could still die. And so, the villagers waited, not with hope, but with resignation. The seeds had not grown. The earth had closed over them with indifference. And the people, who had once trusted the rhythm of the land as surely as breath, began to wonder what it meant to live in a world with a pattern no longer held. As the days drifted on, each one gray and indistinct from the next, the absence of growth in the fields began to change not just the work of the villagers, but the feel of their mornings, the sound of them, the smell of them, the very texture of how a day would begin. In better years, even in hard ones, morning brought with it a kind of reassurance. Before the roosters even crowed, the smoke would rise, soft, curling threads from hearths and stoves, weaving quietly into the mist and letting a watching neighbor know that life had begun again, that a fire had been stoked, and a meal, however small, was being made. It was the most ordinary sign of all, and because of that, perhaps the most essential. But now, that smoke did not rise. Not always. And when it did, it came late, hesitant, weak, like a memory struggling to lift itself from damp wood. At first, no one said anything about the smoke or the lack of it. It was not the kind of thing one remarked upon. But people noticed. They noticed how few chimneys carried the dark plumes that once danced above rooftops by sunrise. They noticed how the air, which used to carry the smell of porridge or bread or boiling root vegetables, now smelled mostly of wet stone and rot. They noticed that the quiet of dawn was no longer a peaceful one, but a stillness that felt uneasy, like a room that had once been filled with voices and was now left empty after a quarrel. In the earliest hours, when the world was still held in that liminal space between sleep and waking, some villagers stood in their doorways and scanned the rooftops across the lane. The smith's chimney was dark. The widow's hearth, always the first to burn with the scent of cabbage and onion, remained cold. Even the baker's roof, once the most reliable plume in the village, was often bare. It was not just about the food. It was about the rhythm, about the life that came from repetition and certainty. Smoke had once meant that there was something in the pot, something to carry one through the day. Its absence now spoke louder than any hunger. Inside the homes, the change was quieter, but heavier. Fires were not lit, because there was nothing put on them. Kindling once saved with care was no longer wasted when there was no meal to warm. Some burned furniture, but only the legs of broken stools or scraps from abandoned carts. The good was saved, hoarded like treasure, in case a truly cold night demanded it. Without the fires, homes took on a dampness that clung to walls and clothes and skin, making even sleep feel heavier, less restful. The hearth, long the center of family life, sat empty more often than not, a cold hollow where warmth used to live. Those who did still light fires in the morning did so with a kind of shame. The smell of smoke, instead of bringing comfort to neighbors, now stirred something closer to resentment or worse, longing. One could not help but wonder what they were cooking, how they had food to spare, why their pots still bubbled while others scraped at the last of their grain. The sound of spoons against iron could no longer be ignored. It marked the household as fortunate, or as hoarders, depending on the mood of those who passed by. The children felt the shift too, though they lacked the words for it. They awoke without the smell of breakfast. Their eyes, still crusted with sleep, opened not to the comfort of a fire, but to the quiet creak of a house that had gone still. Some asked questions. Others stopped asking. They learned to accept the mornings as they were, to dress without warmth, to chew old bread that had gone hard enough to require soaking, or to wait silently while their parents tried to hide how little was left. In those quiet houses, meals became symbolic. A bowl of thin broth passed between siblings, a crust softened in water and shared with care. Salt, if there was any, became the only remaining flavor, its sting now as precious as sweetness once was. No one expected full bellies. The goal had shifted entirely, from feeding to staving off. It was not about pleasure, but postponement, not about nourishment, but survival. Even the animals seemed quieter. Dogs, once eager for table scraps, now lay curled in corners, thinner and more watchful than before. Cats hunted with more aggression, dragging home creatures they once would have ignored. Mice, birds, even beetles. Chickens, when they still clucked in some lucky yards, were no longer seen as producers of eggs, but as meals yet to be eaten. And when one went missing, no questions were asked. Everyone understood. The silence extended beyond the homes. In the fields, where once there had been morning greetings between neighbors tending rows and mending fences, there was now only the occasional nod. Conversation dried up like the seed that had refused to sprout. Even gossip faded. What was there to say, when everyone lived the same story? It was not a time of drama, but of slow erosion, of habits breaking down, of comfort receding, of lives shrinking inward. And so, morning became just another hour to endure. Gone were the little rituals that had once made it bearable. The smell of smoke, the warmth of the bowl, the laughter of children nudging each other at the hearth. In their place was cold air, quiet voices, and the soft creak of homes that waited for news that never came. There were still sunrises, of course, though few took note of them. The sun, when it appeared, did so half-heartedly, casting a dull light that illuminated nothing new. It was not the beginning of a fresh day. It was simply the continuation of the last one, and the one before that. And with each new morning that came without smoke, without scent, without fire, something else vanished too. Hope, perhaps, or the illusion of normalcy, or the belief that the season would end like all the others had. Eventually, and with relief, what remained was the wait, and in that wait, the growing understanding that what had begun as a season was becoming something else, something longer, heavier, and far more dangerous than anyone had dared to name. By the time the smoke had vanished almost entirely from the mornings, the change inside the homes was no longer subtle. It was visible. It was written across faces and in the way people moved, slower, quieter, with the economy of those who had learned to conserve not just food, but energy itself. The larders, once the pride of a household and the silent measurement of a family's foresight, now stood nearly bare. Their shelves, once lined with preserved vegetables, cheeses wrapped in wax, and cloth-covered jars of pickled roots, now held little more than dust and memories. In some homes, the cupboard doors remained closed, not out of secrecy, but because there was nothing left to see behind them. It is a strange thing, the silence of a larder. For a place that holds no voice, its emptiness speaks with a weight few other spaces can match. A child might open the door 3, 4, 5 times in a day, hoping by some miracle that something had appeared. But the shelves offered no such mercy. They held only the impressions of things once stored. Faint circles where a jar used to sit. Tiny crumbs tucked into grooves of old wood, and a lingering scent of dried herbs that had long since been used up in desperate stews. Even the rats, once a nuisance, had largely abandoned these rooms. There was nothing left for them either, and as the larders emptied, so too did the people. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow and quiet unraveling. Faces thinned, skin tightened against cheekbones and foreheads, and the hollows beneath the eyes deepened, until even the most youthful appeared aged. The robust laughter of the village, the kind that used to roll across the square during festivals or at the end of harvest, was replaced by something smaller. Murmurs, soft questions, and eventually silence. When people did smile, it was brief and exhausted, often given only to reassure a child or deflect a question they couldn't answer. The lines around those smiles deepened. Hunger, when it lingers long enough, etches itself not just into the body, but into the soul. Eyes became the most telling part. You could walk through a village now and see it there, in the way people looked at one another. They no longer made long contact. Their eyes flitted quickly over shoulders, toward hands, toward baskets. Not out of cruelty, but calculation. Everyone was watching, not for theft, but for a clue. Who had food, who might be hiding stores, who looked slightly fuller than the rest. The baker's daughter, who still wore a hint of color in her cheeks, became the object of whispers. Had they saved more than others? Were they being fed in secret? And yet no one dared ask aloud. Suspicion lived quietly, like everything else. Even the animals, those that remained, became strange symbols of both hope and guilt. A family with a chicken might guard it like a sacred relic. But each morning they woke wondering if that day would be the one they finally killed it. Goats were whispered about in the lanes, not because they were producing milk, they often weren't, but because they represented potential. A few weeks of meals, maybe more. But once the animal was gone, it would not return. And so, many households held on to them longer than they should have, watching them grow thinner and weaker alongside themselves in a silent mutual decline. It was during this time that the village's social rituals began to decay. Visits between neighbors slowed, then stopped. It became harder to knock on a friend's door without imagining what you might ask for or what they might think you wanted. The gatherings in the square, once filled with barter and laughter, were now sparse and wary. Even the communal oven, once a place where people brought their loaves to bake and shared news over warm crusts, now stood cold for days at a time. The joy of communal baking had been replaced by the fear that someone might see what little you still had. Children were the first to speak about the hunger, and also the first to stop speaking. At first, they asked questions. When will the bread come? Why is the pot so light? But over time, their questions grew less frequent. They understood, in a way only children do, by watching the lines deepen on their mothers' faces, and by counting how often the pot was left empty on the hearth. Hunger became not just a condition of the body, but a rhythm of the home. Fewer meals, longer silences, less laughter, more sleep, not because they were tired, but because it helped them forget. And dreams became different, too. People spoke of them sometimes, in hushed tones, between chores that were hard to complete now that strength was failing. They dreamed of feasts, of course, of long tables with roasted meats and apples stuffed with honey. But they also dreamed of absurd things, of chewing on grass that turned to bread in the mouth, or of rivers that flowed with soup, or of snow that could be boiled into milk. They woke with the taste of these visions still on their tongues, and the ache of disappointment fresh in their bellies. The priests spoke often during this time, but their words carried less weight than before. Hunger made faith a thinner thread to hold on to. Some found comfort in prayer, repeating familiar verses not because they believed in salvation, but because the repetition was something to do, something that had not yet abandoned them. Others grew bitter. Why would God ignore such suffering? Why allow innocent children to sleep with empty bellies? The church still opened its doors each morning, but the pews were no longer full. Faith, like flour, was something each person now rationed in private, and the days kept coming, one after another, each one a little quieter, a little heavier. The empty shelves remained empty. The hollow eyes remained hollow. And though no one spoke it directly, a question hung in the air above every home. How much longer can we endure this? The famine had not yet reached its worst, but it had taken its seat at the table, and it was not leaving. By the time real food had all but vanished from the village, ingenuity replaced routine. What once would have been dismissed as laughable or even mad now became the daily ritual of survival. The shelves were empty. The fields were bare. The livestock were gone. And so people turned to what the earth still gave them, though not out of generosity, but indifference. What had once been considered unthinkable began to seem logical, even necessary. People began to boil what they could not chew. Bark, roots, leaves, leather, anything that could soften in water might serve as a meal or something close to it. It began with bark, the inner layers of tree trunks. The pale, stringy substance tucked beneath the rough outer shell were stripped from ash and elm and birch with slow, carving hands. The first few pots held small, cautious handfuls, soaked for hours in hopes of drawing out something edible. The resulting broth, if it could be called that, was bitter and gray, more memory than flavor. But it was warm, and in its warmth there was at least the illusion of nourishment. Children sipped it as if it were medicine. Adults swallowed it slowly, feeling the bark slide down with the texture of damp paper. It was not satisfying, but it was something. Bones, too, found new life. Old bones, dug up from compost piles or taken from the last of the stew meat from weeks before, were cracked with stones and boiled for days in iron pots. Any trace of marrow was a gift. The water turned cloudy, thin, with the faintest trace of oil shimmering on its surface. Some added herbs, dried if they had them, wilted and browning if they did not. Even the scent of thyme or sage, faint as it was, helped disguise the emptiness. Bone water, as they began to call it, was passed around in wooden cups, steaming gently, offering warmth more than sustenance. It was no longer about fullness. It was about ritual, something placed in the bowl at mealtime so that the meal, however symbolic, would still happen. Leather was softened, too. Old belts, bits of harness, the tongues of shoes, if they were not too worn. Soaked for hours, chewed slowly, they offered little but texture. But texture, in a world of starvation, became meaningful. Something to gnaw on, something to hold in the mouth and trick the mind. Stories spread of people boiling candles, if they had them, trying to draw a trace of fat from wax. Others boiled moss scraped from stones, or wild ferns picked from the damp edges of the forest, praying they weren't poisonous. But the fear of poison had been replaced by a different fear, the certainty of going hungry. And still, the days crept on. People became thinner, not just in body but in voice. They spoke less, and when they did, their voices rasped. Lips cracked, cheeks sank. The sound of coughing echoed more frequently through narrow alleys and crooked doorways. Not the deep cough of illness, but the shallow, dry cough of a throat that no longer produced enough moisture. Even crying, when it came, was quieter. Children learned not to sob, for sobbing took strength. Instead, they whimpered, clutching dolls made from scraps, or pressing themselves into corners where the cold could not find them. In the woods, more desperate measures took root. The underbrush was picked clean. Berries, if any remained, were sour and shriveled. The squirrels had vanished. Birds had grown wary. Traps once used for rabbit or hare now caught nothing but frost. And the silence of the forest, once a place of peace, now held a different weight. A warning, perhaps. The forest, like the village, had been stripped bare. And then there were the whispers. Not loud, never loud, but persistent. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, from one house to the next, often by those who swore they did not believe them. Someone, it was said, had found a way to survive, had meat when others did not, had strength in their voice. Perhaps they'd found a store left hidden. Or perhaps, and here the whisper dropped lower, perhaps they'd found another way, a darker way. No one said the word aloud, but they didn't have to. Suspicion brewed like the bone water on every hearth. Doors were watched. Steps were counted. Meals, if they could still be called that, were observed. Was that grease on the lip of the pot? Was that a meat bone, freshly cracked? In desperation, the line between life and law blurred. No one dared accuse, but no one stopped watching. And the bodies changed. The way people moved hunched and slow, as if each motion cost more than it gave. The way skin stretched too tight over joints. The way the eyes darkened and sank. Men who once stood tall as oxen now shuffled like elders. Women who once sang while baking bread now whispered lullabies to empty cradles. And through it all, the sound of boiling. Every day, every house. Something in a pot. Even if it was just bark and leather and water, the ritual had to continue. The priest began to visit more frequently. Not with food, he had none to give, but with words. Suffering purifies, he said once, and the words were met with silence. He did not repeat them. Instead, he prayed, and even then he did so with lowered eyes, for even the sanctuary was not immune. The stone walls of the church echoed with hunger now. The candles burned lower. The icons looked out with eyes that saw nothing. And when people began to die, quietly in the night or sitting by empty hearths, the village did not wail. It mourned with a kind of numb understanding. Graves were dug, though the ground was hard. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, if there was any left. And each burial came with a silent question, who would be next? Still, each day, the fires were lit. The pots were filled. The bark was stripped. The bones were boiled again and again until they split apart and became dust at the bottom of the kettle. For what else could they do? Hunger does not ask permission. It only waits. And in those quiet, desperate kitchens, the people of the village waited with it, boiling bark, sipping bone water, holding on to the smallest illusion of fullness they could find. The famine had not yet reached its worst, but it had taken its seat at the table, and it was not leaving. By the time real food had all but vanished from the village, ingenuity replaced routine. What once would have been dismissed as laughable or even mad now became the daily ritual of survival. The shelves were empty. The fields were bare. The livestock were gone. And so people turned to what the earth still gave them, though not out of generosity, but indifference. What had once been considered unthinkable began to seem logical, even necessary. People began to boil what they could not chew. Bark, roots, leaves, leather, anything that could soften in water might serve as a meal or something close to it. It began with bark. The inner layers of tree trunks, the pale, stringy substance tucked beneath the rough outer shell, were stripped from ash and elm and birch with slow, carving hands. The first few pots held small, cautious handfuls, soaked for hours in hopes of drawing out something edible. The resulting broth, if it could be called that, was bitter and gray, more memory than flavor. But it was warm, and in its warmth there was at least the illusion of nourishment. Children sipped it as if it were medicine. Adults swallowed it slowly, feeling the bark slide down with the texture of damp paper. It was not satisfying, but it was something. Bones, too, found new life. Old bones, dug up from compost piles or taken from the last of the stew meat from weeks before, were cracked with stones and boiled for days in iron pots. Any trace of marrow was a gift. The water turned cloudy, thin, with the faintest trace of oil shimmering on its surface. Some added herbs, dried if they had them, wilted and browning if they did not. Even the scent of thyme or sage, faint as it was, helped disguise the emptiness. Bone water, as they began to call it, was passed around in wooden cups, steaming gently, offering warmth more than sustenance. It was no longer about fullness. It was about ritual, something placed in the bowl at mealtime so that the meal, however symbolic, would still happen. Leather was softened, too. Old belts, bits of harness, the tongues of shoes, if they were not too worn. Soaked for hours, chewed slowly, they offered little but texture. But texture, in a world of starvation, became meaningful. Something to gnaw on, something to hold in the mouth and trick the mind. Stories spread of people boiling candles, if they had them, trying to draw a trace of fat from wax. Others boiled moss scraped from stones, or wild ferns picked from the damp edges of the forest, praying they weren't poisonous. But the fear of poison had been replaced by a different fear, the certainty of going hungry. And still, the days crept on. People became thinner, not just in body but in voice. They spoke less, and when they did, their voices rasped. Lips cracked, cheeks sank. The sound of coughing echoed more frequently through narrow alleys and crooked doorways. Not the deep cough of illness, but the shallow, dry cough of a throat that no longer produced enough moisture. Even crying, when it came, was quieter. Children learned not to sob, for sobbing took strength. Instead, they whimpered, clutching dolls made from scraps, or pressing themselves into corners where the cold could not find them. In the woods, more desperate measures took root. The underbrush was picked clean. Berries, if any remained, were sour and shriveled. The squirrels had vanished. Birds had grown wary. Traps once used for rabbit or hare now caught nothing but frost. And the silence of the forest, once a place of peace, now held a different weight. A warning, perhaps. The forest, like the village, had been stripped bare. And then there were the whispers. Not loud, never loud, but persistent. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, from one house to the next, often by those who swore they did not believe them. Someone, it was said, had found a way to survive, had meat when others did not, had strength in their voice. Perhaps they'd found a store left hidden. Or perhaps, and here the whisper dropped lower, perhaps they'd found another way, a darker way. No one said the word aloud, but they didn't have to. Suspicion brewed like the bone water on every hearth. Doors were watched. Steps were counted. Meals, if they could still be called that, were observed. Was that grease on the lip of the pot? Was that a meat bone, freshly cracked? In desperation, the line between life and law blurred. No one dared accuse, but no one stopped watching. And the bodies changed. The way people moved hunched and slow, as if each motion cost more than it gave. The way skin stretched too tight over joints. The way the eyes darkened and sank. Men who once stood tall as oxen now shuffled like elders. Women who once sang while baking bread now whispered lullabies to empty cradles. And through it all, the sound of boiling. Every day, every house. Something in a pot. Even if it was just bark and leather and water, the ritual had to continue. The priest began to visit more frequently. Not with food, he had none to give, but with words. Suffering purifies, he said once, and the words were met with silence. He did not repeat them. Instead, he prayed, and even then he did so with lowered eyes, for even the sanctuary was not immune. The stone walls of the church echoed with hunger now. The candles burned lower. The icons looked out with eyes that saw nothing. And when people began to die, quietly in the night or sitting by empty hearths, the village did not wail. It mourned with a kind of numb understanding. Graves were dug, though the ground was hard. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, if there was any left. And each burial came with a silent question, who would be next? Still, each day, the fires were lit. The pots were filled. The bark was stripped. The bones were boiled again and again until they split apart and became dust at the bottom of the kettle. For what else could they do? Hunger does not ask permission. It only waits. And in those quiet, desperate kitchens, the people of the village waited with it, boiling bark, sipping bone water, holding on to the smallest illusion of fullness they could find. The famine had not yet reached its worst, but it had taken its seat at the table. and it was not leaving. By the time real food had all but vanished from the village, ingenuity replaced routine. What once would have been dismissed as laughable or even mad now became the daily ritual of survival. The shelves were empty, the fields were bare, the livestock were gone. And so people turned to what the earth still gave them, though not out of generosity, but indifference. What had once been considered unthinkable began to seem logical, even necessary. People began to boil what they could not chew. Bark, roots, leaves, leather, anything that could soften in water might serve as a meal or something close to it. It began with bark, the inner layers of tree trunks. The pale, stringy substance tucked beneath the rough outer shell were stripped from ash and elm and birch with slow, carving hands. The first few pots held small, cautious handfuls, soaked for hours in hopes of drawing out something edible. The resulting broth, if it could be called that, was bitter and gray, more memory than flavor. But it was warm, and in its warmth there was at least the illusion of nourishment. Children sipped it as if it were medicine. Adults swallowed it slowly, feeling the bark slide down with the texture of damp paper. It was not satisfying, but it was something. Bones, too, found new life. Old bones, dug up from compost piles or taken from the last of the stew meat from weeks before, were cracked with stones and boiled for days in iron pots. Any trace of marrow was a gift. The water turned cloudy, thin, with the faintest trace of oil shimmering on its surface. Some added herbs, dried if they had them, wilted and browning if they did not. Even the scent of thyme or sage, faint as it was, helped disguise the emptiness. Bone water, as they began to call it, was passed around in wooden cups, steaming gently, offering warmth more than sustenance. It was no longer about fullness. It was about ritual, something placed in the bowl at mealtime so that the meal, however symbolic, would still happen. Leather was softened, too. Old belts, bits of harness, the tongues of shoes, if they were not too worn. Soaked for hours, chewed slowly, they offered little but texture. But texture, in a world of starvation, became meaningful. Something to gnaw on, something to hold in the mouth and trick the mind. Stories spread of people boiling candles, if they had them, trying to draw a trace of fat from wax. Others boiled moss scraped from stones, or wild ferns picked from the damp edges of the forest, praying they weren't poisonous. But the fear of poison had been replaced by a different fear, the certainty of going hungry. And still, the days crept on. People became thinner, not just in body but in voice. They spoke less, and when they did, their voices rasped. Lips cracked, cheeks sank. The sound of coughing echoed more frequently through narrow alleys and crooked doorways. Not the deep cough of illness, but the shallow, dry cough of a throat that no longer produced enough moisture. Even crying, when it came, was quieter. Children learned not to sob, for sobbing took strength. Instead, they whimpered, clutching dolls made from scraps, or pressing themselves into corners where the cold could not find them. In the woods, more desperate measures took root. The underbrush was picked clean. Berries, if any remained, were sour and shriveled. The squirrels had vanished. Birds had grown wary. Traps once used for rabbit or hare now caught nothing but frost. And the silence of the forest, once a place of peace, now held a different weight. A warning, perhaps. The forest, like the village, had been stripped bare. And then there were the whispers. Not loud, never loud, but persistent. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, from one house to the next, often by those who swore they did not believe them. Someone, it was said, had found a way to survive, had meat when others did not, had strength in their voice. Perhaps they'd found a store left hidden. Or perhaps, and here the whisper dropped lower, perhaps they'd found another way, a darker way. No one said the word aloud, but they didn't have to. Suspicion brewed like the bone water on every hearth. Doors were watched. Steps were counted. Meals, if they could still be called that, were observed. Was that grease on the lip of the pot? Was that a meat bone, freshly cracked? In desperation, the line between life and law blurred. No one dared accuse, but no one stopped watching. And the bodies changed. The way people moved hunched and slow, as if each motion cost more than it gave. the way skin stretched too tight over joints, the way the eyes darkened and sank. Men who once stood tall as oxen now shuffled like elders. Women who once sang while baking bread now whispered lullabies to empty cradles. And through it all, the sound of boiling. Every day, every house. Something in a pot. Even if it was just bark and leather and water, the ritual had to continue. The priest began to visit more frequently. Not with food, he had none to give, but with words. "Suffering purifies," he said once, and the words were met with silence. He did not repeat them. Instead, he prayed, and even then he did so with lowered eyes, for even the sanctuary was not immune. The stone walls of the church echoed with hunger now. The candles burned lower. The icons looked out with eyes that saw nothing. And when people began to die, quietly in the night or sitting by empty hearths, the village did not wail. It mourned with a kind of numb understanding. Graves were dug, though the ground was hard. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, if there was any left. And each burial came with a silent question: who would be next? Still, each day, the fires were lit. The pots were filled. The bark was stripped. The bones were boiled again and again until they split apart and became dust at the bottom of the kettle. For what else could they do? Hunger does not ask permission. It only waits. And in those quiet, desperate kitchens, the people of the village waited with it, boiling bark, sipping bone water, holding on to the smallest illusion of fullness they could find. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since anyone in the village had tasted bread. Not the flat cakes made of acorn flour and boiled moss, not the gritty mash of barley husks and ash, but real bread, the kind made from milled grain, soft and warm, with a crust that cracked under a knife and a center that steamed when torn apart. The memory of it lingered more vividly than most things. Bread had once been the quiet heartbeat of daily life. It did not need to be celebrated because it was constant, expected, shared. But now, even the memory of that certainty felt distant, like a dream glimpsed upon waking that slipped through the fingers before the first thought could catch it. And so, when one woman, a widow named Lise, who lived in the crooked stone house just beyond the old well, discovered a cloth-wrapped bundle at the back of her loft, she stared at it for a long time before touching it. It had been hidden for years, saved from some earlier time of grief, forgotten behind a box of rotting onions and the curling pages of an old prayer book. Inside the bundle was flour, real flour, rough and dry and yellow with age, but still usable. Not much, only enough for one last loaf. She sat within her lap for hours, pressing the cloth to her face, trying to decide whether it was a blessing or a curse. She could have hidden it. She could have baked it late at night, eaten in the dark, swallowed each bite with water to stretch the feel of it. But Lise had been alone too long to hoard something so sacred. Instead, she waited until morning and lit her hearth as she once had, when her husband was alive and her children still filled the rafters with laughter and wooden swords. The smoke rose above her chimney for the first time in weeks, curling high into the gray dawn, and the neighbors noticed immediately. They watched with cautious eyes, their minds flickering through explanations. Perhaps she had found bark. Perhaps she was boiling herbs. But the scent told them otherwise. It was unmistakable. Bread. It was not a scent so much as a memory. It curled to the village like a ghost, stirring hunger in the deepest part of the belly, a hunger that went beyond food and reached into grief. One by one, the villagers drifted toward the widow's house, not knocking, not speaking, simply standing in the cold, their breath visible, their eyes wide. She did not turn them away. She opened the door and beckoned them in, not with grand gestures, but with a weary nod, the way one welcomes those who have suffered the same loss. The bread was small, a single round, no bigger than a plate. It had cracked along the top, the crust dark from fire that had burned too hot. It would not have been enough for even one family in better years. But now, it was something more than food. It was a reminder. It was the shape of what had once been. The widow placed it on the center of her table, tore it slowly, and passed the pieces out, one to each person who had gathered. No one spoke. No one cried. They simply took their piece and held it in their hands, as if it might vanish if they were not careful. Some ate it immediately. Others held it for minutes, tracing the edge of crust with their thumb. The children, wide-eyed and still as mice, stared at their portion like it was gold. It was not sweet. It was not soft. The flour was old. The salt had settled unevenly. But it was bread. And as the last crumb passed between cracked lips, a quiet settled into the room. Not the heavy silence of grief, but something lighter. For a moment, a very brief moment, there was peace, warmth, shared memory. The illusion, however fragile, that things might one day return to what they had been. Word of the bread spread quickly, and not just the fact of it, but the act of it, that someone had shared the last of their flour, that a single loaf had been divided between hands that once might have fought over less. And in the days that followed, others began to do the same, not with flour, for none had it, but with whatever small thing they possessed. A dried apple, split 6 ways, a scrap of goat's cheese, sliced thin as parchment, a half-dozen dried peas, cooked and shared among 3 homes. It was not enough to feed, but it was enough to remember how to share. Yet even such kindness could not stave off the growing fear that the worst had not yet come. The hunger that gripped the village was not dramatic. It did not kill in waves. It was slow, methodical, like a tide that pulled away not in crashes, but in small retreats. Each week, someone else did not wake. Each week, a home stood quieter than before. And with each absence, the silence grew more complete. One morning, the widow's hearth did not smoke. No scent rose into the air, and those who had shared her bread understood. She had given the last of what she had, not because she could, but because she knew it would be the end. When they entered her home, she was seated at the table, her head resting against the wood, her hands empty. She had not suffered. She had only drifted away, as if following her family, one by one, into the fog that hunger brings. They buried her quietly, with a piece of cloth tied around her hands, the same cloth that had once held the flour. And though no sermon was spoken, I remembered the loaf she had made, the loaf that had reminded them, even for a moment, that they were still human, that they still knew how to share. And in a time when food had become myth, that memory was more precious than grain. Even as the people of the village grew thinner and quieter, and their homes colder and darker with each passing week, their eyes still drifted, always, unthinkingly, back toward the fields. It was instinct, perhaps. The land had fed them for as long as any could remember. Its failures had never lasted, not truly. A late frost, a bad rain, a pestilence of worms. These things came and went like bad dreams. The soil always forgave. But now, it seemed the earth itself had turned cold, and though the fields stretched out across the hills in familiar lines, furrows etched by generations long gone, they were no longer places of promise. They had become graveyards of seed, silent and unmoved by the desperation of those who still dared to work them. But some tried. They had to. The thought of giving up the fields entirely was like letting go of breath. It was unthinkable, even if their efforts were doomed before they began. And so, in the early hours when the mist still hung low and the sky was the color of ash, a few figures could still be seen moving across the frozen ground. Bent, slow, wrapped in rags and wool, carrying baskets that no longer held anything to sew, only tools dull with rust and dirt. Their feet sank into mud that had never properly dried from the year before, a mud too wet to hold roots, too sticky to be turned. Still, they dug. They planted what they had left. Seeds saved from the year before, often too few, too small, or too old to sprout. Some planted grains that had already gone soft from mold, hoping against reason. Others tried again with broad beans and barley, the hardy crops, the ones that survive anything. But the rain came wrong. It came when it was not needed, and held back when it was. The sun, too, seemed confused. It flickered behind clouds for weeks at a time, emerging only long enough to dry the topsoil into a cracked crust before disappearing again. Wind flattened the early shoots. Birds, starving themselves, tore up what green dared to emerge. And so the fields remained mostly bare, except for patches of stubborn weeds and mossy outgrowths that mocked the careful rows. Some villagers, in desperation, tried to eat these too. They pulled dandelions and thistle, boiled nettles until the sting was gone, even chewed the tops of wild grasses. But these were not crops. They were signs that the land was alive. Yes, but not for them. Not in the way they had once believed. There was one field, just beyond the churchyard, that seemed more cursed than the rest. It had once been the most generous plot in the region, thick with wheat that grew tall and golden, heavy heads bowing toward the earth in late summer. It was tended by a man named Robart, whose father and grandfather had plowed its lines before him. He had always spoken of the field with reverence, as though it were not merely soil, but something closer to kin. But even he, who once whispered to the earth as he worked it, found only silence in return. That year, Robart tried again. He dug with a broken spade, his hands wrapped in linen. He did not complain when the mud caked his boots or when the coal bit into his joints. He worked with the intensity of someone who no longer believed in success, but could not live with the shame of surrender. For weeks, he returned each morning, scattering seeds with trembling fingers, drawing water from the near-frozen stream, and marking the spots where the smallest sprout might emerge. The villagers watched from a distance, their expressions hard to read. Some admired him, others pitied him. A few whispered that he had lost his mind, but no one tried to stop him. No one offered help, either. They had nothing to spare, not time, not seed, not hope. Each person clung to their own hollow efforts, afraid that to give up even one gesture of survival would hasten their own end. And then one morning, something strange happened. Robart's field sprouted. Not fully, not in golden waves as in years past, but in small patchy clusters, green shoots rising against the odds, pale and fragile, yet undeniable. The sight of them stopped him in his tracks. He fell to his knees in the mud, not from prayer, but exhaustion, staring at the life that had come from dead soil. It wasn't enough to feed the village. It wasn't enough to save even one family. But it was something, a beginning, a refusal, perhaps. The field, in its stubbornness, mirrored Robart himself. Too worn to thrive, but too proud to die. Word of the shoots spread slowly, and people began to pass the field more often. They did not speak. They did not dare step too close. But they looked, and in their looking, something small shifted. A boy brought a handful of water. A girl scattered crushed eggshells, a trick her grandmother had taught her. Others offered silence, which was sometimes the kindest gift of all. They let the field be, and it grew, bit by bit, until patches of green touched one another, like fingers reaching out after a long sleep. Of course, the harvest, if it came, would not arrive for months, and it might still fail. A sudden frost, or a plague of insects, or some turn of weather no one could name. But for now, there was a field that had not given up, and in a village that had long forgotten the taste of bread and the promise of soil. That was more than enough. So they watched and they waited, not with hope, not quite, but with something gentler, a willingness to believe again, not in miracles, but in effort, in soil, in the simple, brutal truth that sometimes the earth, like the people who walk it, chooses to endure, not because it must, but because it cannot help but try. Though the green shoots in Robart's field had begun to rise with quiet defiance, the sky above had not softened his heart. In truth, the sky seemed to hold no sentiment at all, no care for suffering, no recognition of growth, no gratitude for the prayers whispered from tired mouths below. And as spring gave way to summer, the rain came, not with a gentle rhythm that brings life, but with a cruel persistence, falling in long, cold sheets that soaked the land with rhythm too heavy, too constant, and too late. At first, the people welcomed it. After so many dry seasons, the sound of rainfall was a comfort. Children even stepped into the lanes barefoot, arms outstretched, letting the drops strike their thin arms like blessings. But by the second week, the joy had vanished. The ground, already softened from previous years of poor drainage and neglected care, turned quickly to mire. Pathways disappeared beneath inches of water. Homes built low to the ground were flooded, their dirt floors now mud. Rain seeped through roofs that hadn't been patched in years, dripping onto sleeping faces and hearths long extinguished. And in the fields, especially Robart's, the sprouts trembled under the weight of waterlogged soil, their roots struggling for breath. Rain, when it comes to hungry land, must arrive like a guest, welcome, timely, respectful. But this rain came like a siege. It pounded for hours without pause, and when it stopped, it left behind a silence filled not with calm but with dread. The air was thick and sour, the earth saturated beyond endurance. Seeds that had been coaxed into germination began to rot where they lay. The shoots that had emerged with such fragile pride now bent under their own weight, yellowing at the base, their tips curling. Farmers, what few remained, stood with hands on their hips, staring not in anger but in disbelief. How could rain, the very thing they begged for, betray them so completely? Robart's field, that stubborn patch of green, became a battleground. He went each morning, boots swallowed by mud, shoulders hunched against the wind, and used what little he had, sticks, broken thatch, a ragged cloak, to shield his crops from the worst of the deluge. He dug shallow ditches with a rusted spade to redirect water, scooped puddles with a cracked bowl, but the rain did not care. It fell and fell, not in anger, but in apathy. It did not roar or thunder. It whispered, a soft, steady mockery of effort. The villagers watched, some with pity, others with a cold detachment of those who had already stopped hoping. They, too, fought the water in their own ways, propping up sagging walls with old beams, hanging linens where ceilings leaked, catching rain in pots they once used for cooking. But most efforts were futile. The village became slick, muddy, and mold-covered. The air was never dry. Clothes clung to the skin. Blankets smelled of damp rot. Fires struggled to stay lit. And food, what little remained, began to spoil faster. Grain turned sour in sacks. Roots turned black at the tips. Even stored water, meant to sustain them through dry seasons, became tainted. Its barrels now host to floating bits of fungus and ash. The children grew quiet again. Illness returned, not with fever, but with coughs that never stopped and bellies that bloated with emptiness. A sickness of the gut spread quickly, fed by wetness and unclean hands, and it became harder and harder to tell if someone was simply hungry or already dying. And through it all, the rain persisted. It turned the days gray and the nights impossible to sleep through, its constant tapping a cruel lullaby against the stones. The priest, ever loyal in his rounds, stopped wearing shoes. There was no point. His boots had long since filled with water, and he found the mud easier to navigate barefoot. He still spoke of God, but now he did so in shorter phrases, not out of lack of faith, but because the people could no longer listen for long. Their eyes drifted. Their minds were elsewhere, counting how many days the barley had been under water, whether their roof would survive one more night, whether their cough was worse than yesterday. And the priest, though he never said it aloud, had begun to wonder something terrible. Not whether they would be delivered, but whether they had been forgotten. In one house, a young woman tried to bake. She had found a bit of flour left in an old sack, dry and pale beneath the mold at the top. She scraped it into a bowl, mixed it with water from a pitcher she had boiled twice. She shaped it into a flat cake and placed it on a stone at the hearth. But the fire would not catch, and the stone remained cold. And by the time the smoke began to rise, the dough had already begun to dissolve in the humid air. She wept, not because she was hungry, but because she had hoped. And hope, in this weather, was the most painful thing of all. Eventually, even the animals refused to venture out. Dogs curled in corners and refused to bark. Cats disappeared entirely. Birds stopped singing. The world had become still, save for the endless, endless drip of rain. Drip, 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 and in that repetition, people lost track of time. Days bled into each other. The sun was a rumor, and when they spoke, if they spoke, it was only to say that it could not last forever, that it had to stop, that the sky would tire. But secretly, in their bones, they began to fear it would not, that this was not a storm, but a new way of being, that they would drown not in floods, but in weariness, in the soft, choking heaviness of rain that gave no relief. Still, each morning, Robart returned to his field. He walked the rows, now muddy ditches. He touched each plant, now bent and browning. He whispered to the soil, even when it responded only with the sound of rain on leaves. And still, impossibly, a few of the shoots remained upright, not thriving, but surviving. And perhaps that, in itself, was a kind of defiance. a kind of prayer louder than any the priest could speak. In a world soaked with sorrow, something still grew, bent, broken, but alive, before the grain spoils completely, before the walls sag under the weight of rain, before even the sickness truly takes root in the bellies of the hungry. The rats arrive, always first, always unseen at the start, always in numbers greater than one might imagine. They don't come in haste or panic, but with the calm certainty of creatures who've learned to thrive in human failure. They do not scurry in corners right away. They observe. They listen. They wait, sensing, perhaps more acutely than the villagers themselves, the rhythm of decay. And when the time is right, when the first sacks split and the first walls crumble and the first fires go unlit, they make themselves known. At first, it was just sounds, scratching, light and rhythmic, in the eaves or under floorboards, a scuffle across a shelf, a quiet thump in the night, easily dismissed as the settling of old wood. But soon, droppings appeared, black and hard, clustered near the last stores of dried roots and shriveled apples. The few cellars that had not yet flooded became battlegrounds. Pots were found overturned, cloths gnawed through, and most telling of all, footprints in the ash near the hearths, tiny, distinct, deliberate, as if the rats were not merely searching for food, but staking claim. And still, the people hesitated to act. It was not laziness or even fear. It was exhaustion. To wage war against rats required more than traps and vigilance. It required strength, and strength by then had become rarer than bread. Most homes had little left to protect, and what they did have was often not where the energy it would take to defend. A withered turnip, a spoonful of barley, a rind of hardened cheese. These were treasures, yes, but pitiful ones. Not enough to justify the night-long vigilance required to guard them. So the rats grew bolder. They climbed shelves. They crossed sleeping bodies. One woman awoke to find one perched on her chest, its beady eyes glinting in the half-light, unafraid, as if it did not recognize the line between human and animal anymore. She screamed and it vanished. But the scream lingered, an echo of how far things had fallen. Children no longer played near the floor. Beds were raised, where possible, on bricks or stones. But even then, the sense of safety was fragile. Robart, whose field still struggled in the drowning soil, found his own home overtaken. He returned one evening with hands frozen from digging drainage ditches and found his meager pantry overturned, the last of his dried peas scattered like seeds across the floor, chewed open, hollowed out. He sat for a long time staring at them, then swept them slowly into his palm, not to discard but to count. 12 were left untouched. He boiled them with bark and leather that night, and ate them in silence. Some tried to fight back. An old man near the square fashioned traps from buckets and string, catching a few in the first week. He showed the bodies to the children like trophies, but the victory was fleeting. For every rat caught, 5 more appeared. Their nests were hidden deep, their paths mapped in ways that no tired mind could unravel. Cats might once have held them at bay, but the cats had long since vanished. Some starved, others perhaps hunted themselves. Dogs, if any remained, lacked the strength or interest, and so the rats multiplied. In the church, where the priest continued his dwindling prayers, they gnawed through hymnals. The books had been bound in leather, soft and cracking with age. The rats chewed the corners first, then the spines, and eventually the pages themselves. The Word of God, the priest murmured one evening, holding a book with its cover flayed open like skin. Even that is not safe now. He placed it gently on the altar and lit a candle beside it, though he knew the wax would not last. And it was not just the food they threatened. It was the illusion of control. The idea that the village, as poor and broken as it had become, was still theirs. That the homes, even if flooded and crumbling, still belonged to the living. That the hearths, even if cold, still centered the rooms. But now, with every skitter and scratch, with every half-eaten root and foul water jug, the rats reminded them this was no longer their world alone. Hunger had opened the door. Nature had walked in. And beneath that truth lurked a darker fear, one that no one spoke aloud. The rats, after all, had come first. before the plague, before the fever, before the smell. Old stories remembered what the rats meant. They were not just scavengers. They were omens. And in the deepest corners of the village, where light seldom reached, that fear began to grow. That something worse was coming. That the rats were only the beginning. Children began to sleep in pairs, huddled high on tables or tucked between adults. Mothers sat with sticks near the hearths, not to tend fire. They had none, but to swat away what moved in the dark. And in that endless wet, the sound of rats became background music. It was no longer surprise. It was expected. A scratch in the wall, a squeal beneath the floor, a thump in the pantry. These were no longer disruptions. They were routine. One evening, in a house near the edge of the village, a child woke to find a rat chewing at the corner of his blanket. It did not flee when he moved. It simply paused, looked at him, then continued. The boy did not scream. He did not cry. He pulled his feet closer and watched. And in the morning, when he told his mother, she only nodded. "What did it take?" she asked. "Just the corner." "Then let it be." And that was the new law of the famine. If it only took a corner, if it only stole half, if it only chewed but did not bite, then let it be. The rats had come first, and they would remain long after the hunger had taken what it came for. The village had never been grand. Even in its better years, it was little more than a scatter of stone cottages and tilting fences, cradled between two low hills and a stream that once ran sweet, but now stank faintly of rot. But what it lacked in stature, it had made up for in order. There had been rhythm once. The passing of days marked by the toll of the church bell, the sweeping of chimneys, the smell of stews in the air by dusk, births, baptisms, marriages, all conducted with a gentle precision. Each life placed gently in line behind the other, as if time itself walked with quiet purpose through the lanes. And so, too, had it been with death. Death in the village had once been a solemn, orderly thing. The dead were not feared but honored, prepared by hands that knew the weight of such things. They were washed and wrapped, lay upon wooden planks draped in linen, candles lit at the feet and head. There were prayers. There were hymns. There was earth turned with care in the small, walled cemetery near the chapel, where each name was marked, each stone chiseled with modest reverence. Grief was not rushed. It was given space, shaped like the season that follows harvest, long, quiet, and expected. But now, nothing was as it had been. The rain had not stopped, and the rats had grown bolder. Hunger walked the lanes openly, and sleep was no longer peaceful. And so, when death came, as it had begun to do more often, it no longer waited to be noticed. It did not knock softly, nor did it linger in corners, patient and still. It entered homes like a thief, silent and quick, and often left just as quietly, leaving behind hollow shells before anyone could call the priest. At first, they tried to hold to the old rites. A few villagers, clinging to tradition like driftwood and flood, still lit candles, still whispered the prayers. But what was scarce and wax was rarer. The linen shrouds were gone, long ago cut into rags or used to bundle moldy roots. And the churchyard, it could no longer keep pace. The graves came too quickly. The soil, drenched and heavy, refused to yield. Holes dug one day would flood the next. Coffins were abandoned for the simple wrapping of limbs in cloaks or sacks. The markers grew fewer. Names were scratched into wood, then not at all. And then one evening, the priest collapsed while reading from the Book of Hours. He had not eaten in days. He had carried too many bodies with hands grown too thin. He was laid to rest the same night, with no successor to follow him. After that, death became something else. Bodies remained where they fell for longer. In the cold, they kept for a while. But then the warmth came, just enough to turn breath visible and dampness into rot. And with it, the dead no longer waited. They did not wait to be carried. They did not wait to be mourned. They did not wait for sacred words. They filled the spaces between the living like another presence, silent and demanding. Some were moved to sheds, wrapped quickly in whatever cloth remained. Others simply stayed. In one cottage, a mother died beside her child in the night. The child, too young to understand the stillness, remained with her, curled at her side. A neighbor came 2 days later, drawn by the absence of smoke from the chimney. The sight was not shocking anymore. It was, if anything, expected. He did not cry. He did not pray. He simply closed the door behind him and whispered that he would return when the ground could be turned. Elsewhere, a man buried his wife by the river, beneath the roots of an old tree. He did not mark the spot. He feared drawing attention, for fear someone desperate enough might see the burial not as reverence, but opportunity. Clothes were no longer burned, but repurposed. Blankets were needed. Even the dead shoes could not be spared. And then there was a girl, Ida, who had not spoken in weeks, who began to speak to the dead as though they still listened. Her father had died in his chair, upright, his eyes closed as if in prayer. She did not move him. She sat beside him each evening, whispering of the weather, of the rain, of the rats she had seen in the corner. Sometimes she sang. Her voice was small, uncertain, but clear. A song about bread, learned long ago. One night, a passerby heard her through the crack wall and paused, not from horror, but from something deeper, a stillness, as though in that strange, unbroken ritual, Ida had done what none of them could. She had kept grief alive in a world that no longer had space for it. But grief, untended, turns to something else, to silence, to numbness, and soon even Ida's voice was quiet. By midsummer, the village no longer asked how many had died. The question served no purpose. Some houses were simply empty. Others held bodies none had strength to move. The church bell, which had once tolled at every passing, was now silent. Its rope had frayed, and no one had bothered to mend it. And yet, life did not stop. Children still scavenged for roots. Women still patched roofs with rushes and bark. Men still attempted the fields, even if only a handful remained upright. Robart still walked the lines of his drowned crop each day, his face hollow, his hands cracked, but his eyes fixed on the ground, always watching, as though expecting something green to rise again. It was as if the dead had taught them something, the final lesson of famine, that death is not an ending in such times, but a companion, one that follows too closely, that sleeps at your feet, that waits at every doorway. And still, the living walked on, not because of hope, but because the body continues long after the spirit has gone quiet. Hunger does not wait for grief to pass, nor does the rain, and so the village endured, with its silence, with its ghosts, with its doors that no longer opened. The dead no longer waited, and neither did the living. By this stage of the long famine, hunger no longer came in waves. It did not rise and fall with the meals missed or the scraps found. It was no longer sensation at all, not an ache in the belly, not a growl, not even a dizziness in the head. Hunger had become something deeper, something older, something so much a part of life that those who endured it could no longer recall what it felt like to be full. The body, always adaptable, had settled into a new way of being, a quiet, shriveled ache behind the ribs, a dull fog that sat behind the eyes, a twitch in the limbs that never truly slept. It was a state of forgetting, of unlearning the pleasures that once defined humanity. Warm food, slow chewing, the sweet weight of satisfaction. It was as though the village itself had forgotten what bread was, not just its shape or scent, but the very notion that such a thing could exist. Words like baking or kneading felt foreign on the tongue, like relics from a distant land. The ovens were cold. The flour sacks were gone. The fields no longer offered the grain, and even the memory of its taste had begun to fade. Children born during the famine knew food only as bitterness, as boiled weeds, as bark scraped clean of moss, as broth made from bones so old they crumbled in water. And yet, even in this slow collapse, the villagers spoke less and less of hunger, not because they had conquered it, but because hunger had conquered them. It had taken language. It had taken desire. It had settled into the bones like frost and refused to melt. There were no complaints anymore, only glances. No cries of starvation, only the quiet sound of fingers digging into dirt for something. Anything that might resemble food. In one cottage near the western slope, an old man named Cuthbert sat beside the remains of what had once been a kitchen. He held a bowl, though there was nothing in it. He held it as though he still remembered what it meant to eat. His wife had died month before, curled in sleep and never waking. His children had long since scattered, some taken by sickness, others by the roads, seeking distant promises that never came true. And Cuthbert, who had once fed a family with pride, now sat in silence, staring into the bowl as if it might one day fill itself. He was not mad. He was simply empty, emptied of strength, of words, of memory. He could not recall the last meal he had eaten. He did not remember the taste of onions, or the feel of salt on the tongue. But he held the bowl still, because to let it go would be to admit something final, something irreversible. And even now, even with nothing left, there was a small part of him, a flicker, that refused to forget entirely. Elsewhere, a woman boiled leather. She had found an old boot, cracked and stiff with age, beneath the floorboards of a barn. She washed it, cut it into strips, and boiled it with nettles and wild garlic. The water turned yellow. The strips softened barely. She chewed slowly, teeth grinding against the rubbery fibers, swallowing not for nourishment but for the faint hope of it. Her children watched, eyes wide, not because they expected food, but because they did not know any different. This was what eating looked like now. This was a meal. Even the act of chewing had changed. It was no longer about enjoyment. It was about movement, about pretending the body still worked as it should. It was about tricking the mind. And yet, even that became dangerous. One boy, in his desperation, had chewed wood. He had carved a stick into the shape of a root and gnawed on it until his gums bled. When he died, no one spoke of it, not out of cruelty, but because the hunger had taken not just his life, but the language to mourn him. And so the village forgot. It forgot recipes. It forgot feasts. It forgot the slow pleasure of mealtime, the laughter over stew, the warmth of a full belly. The very idea of hunger, as something separate from oneself, had disappeared. There was no longer before or after. There was only this slow, dragging ache that colored everything, even dreams. And in dreams, too, the famine had settled. Some said they dreamed of bread, fresh loaves, warm and soft, broken open by strong hands. Others dreamed of fruit, of meat, of the tang of apples on the tongue. But many dreamed of nothing at all. Hunger had stolen even that, the ability to imagine. The mind, starved alongside the body, no longer painted pictures. It merely endured. A long, gray sleep. Robart, still visiting his drowned field each day, had stopped speaking altogether, not because he had nothing to say, but because his voice no longer held weight. It emerged as little more than a croak, dry and thin. He did not need words, not now. His eyes said enough. They carried the look that so many shared. A gaze not focused on the present nor the past, but something in between. A liminal space where memory faded, and the self became little more than hunger with legs. Still, he worked the field, not with hope, but with routine. He knew which stalks might yet survive. He watched them with the patience of someone who no longer measured time in days or hours, but in breaths. If one green blade still stood, then so would he. And though the rain had softened the soil, and though the roots had rotted in places, he pressed onward, because even when hunger robs memory, it cannot rob instinct. The instinct to feed, to provide, to continue. It was the most brutal truth of the famine. Not that people starved, but that they survived their starvation, that they endured beyond the point of reason, that their bodies became ghosts of themselves, held together by a force not even they understood. It was not will. It was not faith. It was simply hunger, so total, so encompassing, that it no longer felt like pain. It felt like the world. And so the village, silent and soaked, held its breath. It waited, not for relief, but for the next morning, the next small movement. The next moment the wind shifted and maybe, just maybe, a sound could be heard, a crack in the clouds, a change in the air, a whisper from the soil. But mostly it waited for nothing, because even that, in its own terrible way, was easier than remembering what had been. In the darkest folds of the famine, where hunger no longer felt like an emergency, but rather like the shape of life itself, there remained one ancient custom that had, somehow, outlived the rest. The last meal. It was not a feast, nor was it planned with ceremony, but it lingered in the minds of the old. The half-remembered belief that when death drew close, and everyone in time could feel it drawing near, one should eat, not to live, but to leave this world with a gesture of peace. And though food was now more myth than matter, the custom remained, a thread in the tapestry that famine had not yet unraveled. No one said it aloud. It was not a rule, but something understood, the way one understands when the fire is truly dead or when the rain is not going to stop. In those final days, when the breath became shallow and the limbs refused to rise, the village did what it could. A sip of broth, a pinch of barley from a secret stash, a sliver of dried root softened in water. And though the food itself could scarcely be called nourishment, it was the act that mattered. A ritual of goodbye, not for the living, but for the one who would soon not be. Old Gilda, whose eyes had turned cloudy but whose hands still remembered how to bless, had once said softly, "We feed the dying not because they need it, but because we do." She had given her last piece of salted lard to a neighbor 2 winters ago, and now she survived on memories and rainwater steeped with herbs. Still, she found ways to make something, anything, resemble a meal. She would soak bits of bark until they were pliable, then boil them with a stone to create a broth that smelled of something long forgotten. If she had nettles or moldy berries, she would crush them between 2 slate tiles, pretending it was seasoning. And when someone neared the end, when they stopped speaking, when their gaze lingered on a corner of the ceiling where nothing stirred, Gilda would bring the bowl. Most times it was not swallowed. The dying were too weak, too far away already. But still, she would dip a rag and press it to cracked lips, letting the warmth, or what passed for it, touch their tongue. And in those moments, something gentle passed between them, a closing of a door, not with violence, but with a whisper. Once, a child named Elric, no more than 6 winters old, lay in his mother's lap, his eyes half-lidded, his body limp with fever and hunger. Gilda came, carrying her bowl of broth, thin as memory and twice as quiet. She knelt beside them, her bones creaking like an old chair, and offered the child a taste. His mother shook her head. "He hasn't swallowed in days," she said. But Gilda, unmoved, touched the broth to the boy's lips, and the boy, to everyone's astonishment, blinked. His lips parted, not wide, not with appetite, but with something softer, not quite hope, not quite need, simply a response. He took a breath deeper than he had in days. He did not live, but in that moment, he had not quite died. And for a village that had learned to measure life in heartbeats rather than years, that was enough. These moments were rare, not because the dying were few, but because resources were scarce and those who could prepare such offerings were fewer still. But when it happened, when a neighbor gave up the last piece of carrot, or a girl dug up a frostbitten turnip and offered it not to herself, but to a woman on her deathbed, it was remembered, not recorded, not marked in stone, but held in the soft places of the mind where goodness had not yet frozen. It was a kind of resistance, these last meals, not against the famine, for the famine could not be fought, but against the forgetting of what it meant to care, to touch, to provide without expectation. In a world where hunger stripped away so much, dignity, patience, language, this small act remained, a rebellion, gentle and quiet, against the tide of despair. One evening, as the rain softened into mist and the wind quieted enough that you could hear the trees dripping one leaf at a time, a man named Baron sat beside his sister. She had not spoken in days. Her hands trembled like feathers caught in breeze. And yet Baron had found, beneath a stone near the edge of the field, a mushroom. It was small, gray, and bitter, but it was food. He boiled it in water he had filtered through cloth, and added the smallest slice of bark. When it was ready, he carried the bowl to her. He did not speak. She did not wake, but he dipped his fingers into the broth and let it fall drop by drop onto her lips. He remembered feeding her as a child, with porridge and goat's milk, when their mother had been sick. He remembered her laughter. He remembered her hands holding his own when he cried after falling in the river. And now, with no fire and no voice, he fed her again. She died before morning, but her lips had been wet, and Baron, in the hours that followed, held the bowl in his lap and whispered her name again and again until the sun rose behind the wet clouds. The dead were not always buried with these last meals. Often, the vessels used, bowls, rags, spoons, were too precious to leave behind. But sometimes, someone would tuck a root into a hand, a sliver of bark, a berry, soft and nearly spoiled, a message to whatever gods remained. We did not forget them. We fed them, even when we could barely feed ourselves. And so the famine moved on, slow and uncaring, but it did not erase this, not entirely. For every mouth that closed without a word, there was another that tasted one last drop of something warm. And in that moment, perhaps they knew, however dimly, that they had not been abandoned. It was said in quiet voices, especially among the older ones who had lived through enough winters to know what silence meant, that when the body was too empty to eat and the fire had long since gone cold, the mind would wander to places where the hunger could not follow. These were not stories of madness, nor visions drawn from fever. They were something gentler, something older, dreams. Not the sort that flicker and vanish with morning, but deep, drifting visions that came like visitors in the night, bearing gifts of memory and longing. And in these dreams, the villagers feasted. They did not choose to dream. Dreams came unbidden, like birds settling on a still branch, and just as easily startled away. For those too far gone to rise from their blankets, whose breath came in shallow drifts and whose hands lay limp at their sides, the dreams seemed more real than the dim corners of their broken cottages. And though their bodies remained curled on dirt floors or beneath rotted rafters, their minds walked down long-forgotten paths, to kitchens that smelled of broth and butter, to tables laid with bread still warm from the hearth, to the sound of laughter rising above the clink of wooden bowls. In these dreams, hunger was a story already ended. The plates were never empty. The stew never cooled. The loaves never crumbled into dust. And always there was light, soft candlelight or golden shafts of sun falling to the high windows of home that no longer stood. Some dreamed of roast meat, of the skin crackling beneath their teeth, even though many had never tasted such things in life. Others dreamed of apples, bright and red and crisp, the juice running down their chins as they bit in, their mouths remembering sweetness with a clarity their waking minds had long since lost. Old Gilda, who still whispered blessings over her bark and nettle concoctions, once described such a dream to the girl who brought her water each morning. "It was my wedding," she said, her voice no more than a rasp. The table stretched from the door to the garden. There were pies, meat and berry, stacked high as my shoulder. I cut into one, and it sang when the crust broke. She smiled faintly, not with sound, just the feeling, like the pie was happy to be eaten. The girl laughed softly, though her laughter faded quickly in the cold air. The power of the dream was not in the realism. It was in the remembering. Most of those who dreamed of feasts could no longer recall the names of neighbors who had died only weeks ago, or the color of their own mother's eyes, or the last time they had heard music. But they remembered food. They remembered the way of a bowl in the hand, the smell of rosemary on a roast, the feeling of being full, not overstuffed, not sick with abundance, but full in the simple way that once meant survival. And in the famine, where even hope had begun to spoil, this remembering was its own kind of resistance. Some feared these dreams. They saw them not as gifts, but as omens. The feast comes when the soul is ready to leave. One man muttered after waking, his eyes wide, his hands trembling. I saw my father there. He handed me a slice of bread thicker than my palm, said it was time. He refused to eat anything after that. 3 days later, he was gone. Others, though, welcomed the visions. They longed for them. They laid down each night hoping the dreams would return, that the doors would open again and the table would be set, and for a few hours they might remember what it was to be human. Children, especially, dreamed with vivid detail. Perhaps because they had never truly known these meals in life, their minds stitched together scraps of stories and smells into fantastical banquets. One boy described a table that floated above the ground, where dishes refilled themselves the moment they were emptied. A girl spoke of a garden where sausages grew on vines and cheese ripened beneath the leaves. Another child, her cheeks sunken from weeks of sickness, said she had a dream in which she licked a cloud and it tasted like honeyed milk. They shared these dreams in whispers, huddled together on the cold floor of the old chapel. now more shelter than sanctuary. The priest was gone, the altar bare, but the children still gathered there when the rain let up. In a circle, they recounted their visions like fairy tales, as though speaking them aloud might call them back again. And sometimes, just sometimes, it seemed to work. A child would smile in their sleep that night. A hand would move as though reaching for something in the air. A sigh would slip from parched lips, soft and content. Not everyone dreamed. Hunger, like all cruelties, did not distribute its blessings equally. Some laid down and saw nothing. Just darkness. Just cold. Their sleep was shallow, broken by coughing fits or the restless twitch of limbs that remembered walking but no longer moved. For these, the dreams became second-hand, passed on by others, retold in the quiet morning when the fires never lit, and the day offered no warmth. And even hearing them, even imagining, was sometimes enough. Enough to sit up, enough to sip from a shared cup, enough to pretend, for a moment, that hunger had not swallowed everything. Robart, ever silent in his routine, never spoke of dreams. But one night, as he sat in the field that had refused to grow for months, he closed his eyes and let his head drop forward. He did not sleep. His breath stayed steady, his posture upright. But for nearly an hour, he did not move. And when he opened his eyes, the faintest curve touched the corner of his lips. No one saw it but the wind, brushing past like a memory. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back to the village. Dreams did not feed the body. They did not bring warmth or light, but they held something else, something even the famine could not touch. They reminded the dying of life. They reminded the living that they had not yet crossed that final threshold, that somewhere within the hollow chest or the aching spine or the empty belly, there still lived a story of feasts, a story of family, a story of being more than what the hunger had left behind. There are places in human suffering where words begin to falter, where the tongue recoils from truths it cannot name, and the ear, even when it hears, pretends it is not. In the long reach of the famine, as the years blurred into one wet, gray season, and the living began to look more and more like the ghost they buried, there came a moment when hunger crossed a boundary it had not dared approach before. It did not arrive with drums or proclamation. It did not wear a monster's face. It arrived quietly, like most terrible things do, on the backs of whisperers. They began in the outer houses, far from the chapel and the village's sagging heart. There, where help did not come often, and where even the rain seemed reluctant to linger, families disappeared with no sound. Doors stayed shut for days, then weeks. The windows, already blackened with grime, grew still. The smell came later. Faint at first, carried on wind that passed through chimneys and open barns, but unmistakable to those who had lived too long among death. Yet no one spoke of it, not truly. For even in a time when eating boiled leather was no longer strange, there remained one hunger too deep, too dark, to be named aloud. Robart, ever quiet, ever watching, noticed the footprints. A thin trail in the mud leading from a shuttered house to the woods and back again, too deliberate for scavenging. He did not follow it. He did not speak of it. But he did not return to that side of the village again. It was the children who heard the first word spoken. They were sitting near the collapsed smithy, pretending to chew grass like goats, when one of them, a girl with tangled hair and eyes too old for her face, whispered, "Mina's uncle eats bones now." The others froze. The game ended. No one asked questions. One boy laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Then silence returned. And though they never spoke of it again, each child began to watch the faces of the grown-ups more carefully after that, to count who still stirred their stew and who no longer bothered to boil the water. The truth of famine is not in how many die, but in how the living change to survive. And by the second winter, the changes were plain. Those who still had families stayed close, not out of love, but protection. Those alone became watched more closely, sometimes with pity, sometimes with fear. When someone died, there was no rush to claim the body, no procession to the churchyard. Instead, people waited. They waited not to mourn, but to see who would be the first to notice the absence, and who would not. In one house near the old granary, a boy was found sitting beside his sister's body. He was not crying. He was not moving. The bowl beside him had been licked clean, though the hearth was cold and no food had been seen in the house for weeks. When the villagers came to investigate, the boy said only, "She said I could." He was taken in by a widow with too many mouths to feed already. He did not live long, but he did not die hungry. Gilda, the quiet matriarch of rituals long forgotten, began to carry salt with her again, not for cooking. There was nothing to season, but for the old beliefs. Salt to ward off spirits, salt to purify. She sprinkled it around the threshold of her home each night, and when asked why, she simply said, "Not everything hungry wears a stranger's face." And still, the whispers grew. At first, it was only suspicion. But suspicion in times of starvation grows quickly into conviction. A man who walked too freely, who still had strength in his stride when others collapsed, was noticed. A woman with clean hands, despite no water being spared for washing, was watched. Questions were not asked directly. That would require words no one dared speak. Instead, doors were nailed shut from the outside. Smoke was seen rising from chimneys, even when no firewood had been delivered. The smell of roasting flesh, unmistakable and obscene, drifted briefly through the village like a curse carried by the breeze. And no one knocked. Cannibalism, though never named, became a presence, like a wolf that circled the outermost shadows of firelight. It was both a threat and a temptation. For every villager who recoiled at the thought, there was another who, in the quiet of their own home, stared too long at the still body of a loved one, and wondered what difference a few more days might make. Not everyone acted on it. Fewer still admitted it. But all of them, in the end, understood it. And it changed them. The village, once a place of shared suffering, grew sharp with suspicion. People no longer asked after one another. They no longer shared scraps or sat together in silence. Instead, they bolted doors. They slept with knives. They measured every glance, every breath, for signs of danger not from beasts or raiders, but from neighbors, from kin. The famine had become not just a devourer of bodies, but of trust. And when trust died, mercy soon followed. Yet, even amidst this terrible unraveling, not all was lost. There were those who, even in their despair, found ways to protect what little humanity remained. Robart, walking the line of his ruined field, found a boy stealing from his empty traps. The boy's hands were thin as twigs, his eyes wild. Robart said nothing. He turned, walked home, and left the trap empty the next day too. A silent allowance. A quiet refusal to let desperation turn into cruelty. In one cottage, two sisters who had buried their parents with their own hands vowed never to eat alone. Whatever they found, roots, weeds, spoiled berries, they split evenly, even when the portions grew too small to count. "If we die," the elder said, "we die human." It was not bravery. It was not martyrdom. It was memory. A clinging to something older than the hunger. Something that, even in the darkest nights, whispered, "You are not a beast." The famine had taken so much, but not everyone gave everything. And so, the whispers remained. They passed between shutters. They rode the wind. They settled in the corners of homes where no fire burned. They were never spoken as fact, never written down. But they were real as the cold, as real as the rain, as real as the hunger that refused to sleep. And as the village prepared unknowingly for the next chapter in its long decline, the question remained, pressing like frost behind the ribs. If the famine would end tomorrow, what part of themselves would they still have left? There is something sacred about the hearth. In times of warmth and plenty, it is where bread is baked and stories are told, where children fall asleep beside glowing coals and hands are warmed after work. Even in homes where nothing else remains, the hearth stands as a symbol, a hallowed space where comfort once lived, where fire once danced not just for survival, but for joy. But in the third and final year of the Great Famine, the hearth no longer bore that meaning. Its fire had died long before. Its soot had gone undisturbed. And in more than one cottage, the hearth concealed something far colder than ash. The first time they found bones beneath it, they did not speak. A collapsed roof had exposed the cottage to the elements. And when the rains cleared and the neighbors dared enter what had become a tomb, They swept aside the rubble and found the stones uneven. A draft of wind revealed a loose slab. Beneath it, bones. Not animal, not shaped like something slaughtered in haste. These were small bones, human, worn smooth in places, arranged not carelessly, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had meant to keep a secret forever. There was no inquiry, no burial. The famine had stripped the village of an ability to react. Shock no longer lived here. The bones were covered again, the roof ignored, and the house left for the wind and the moss. And yet, once the first hearth gave up its hidden truth, others followed. Not every home, but enough that no one could deny it. Some were older bones, crumbled and colorless, left from the first wave of death. Others were fresh, the marrow still red. In one cottage, a pair of femurs had been scored by teeth. Still, no one used the word. They called it the silence. That's what Gilda began to call it when the children asked why some homes were never spoken of. It was a silence, she'd say, her voice so low it felt like part of the wind. And some things grow in silence when the light is gone. The children did not press her. They had seen enough of the world to understand what she meant without hearing it directly. They too had learned the power of things left unsaid. Robart, who had taken to sleeping near the field even in the rain, walked the village perimeter more frequently now. Not to protect. He was no guard, but to listen. He stopped beside shuttered homes and waited. And sometimes, deep within the stillness, he heard weeping. Not loud, not wild, but slow, tired sobs that spoke not of grief but of confession. He never knocked. He never entered. He simply stood, as if bearing witness without intrusion. There were those who believed the bones should remain untouched, that to disturb them would be to disturb the dead in the wrong way, a violation not of law, but of desperation's twisted mercy. But there were others, especially among the children grown too quickly into adulthood, who began to mark these homes in quiet ways. A symbol scratched into the stone, a string of bark tied across a doorframe. Not curses, not condemnations, just signs, warnings maybe, or memorials, because by now all understood that the bones were not left in malice. No one believed a neighbor had set out to kill in cruelty. The hunger had broken the world open like a rotten fruit, and what spilled out was something no one had ever wanted to see. In one home, the bones were found carefully wrapped in cloth. In another, someone had placed a carved wooden spoon beside the rib cage, as if to honor the role that food, or the lack of it, had played in their undoing. The priest's home, long abandoned, was the last to be entered. When the roof gave in and the door swelled open with rot, a group of men, including Robart, ventured inside. The floor had caved in at one end, near the hearth, where the priest once sat reading aloud in softer days. They found a mass grave beneath the stones. Bones of varying sizes, some scorched, some clean. A broken rosary hung on the wall. A single boot sat beside the pile. It was never known whether the priest had buried others, or if he himself had been buried by someone desperate enough to find God in meat. But after that day, no one entered the chapel again. And yet, not every hearth told the same story. In some homes, they found bundles of dried flowers beneath the stones. Wild flowers, pressed flat, tied with grass. Symbols of hope, of remembrance. One hearth, in the home of a mute girl named Aneth, held not bones but pages, torn from old prayer books, covered in drawings of food, pies with steam, apples in baskets, tables heavy with dishes. She had drawn them with soot and crushed berries, her way of preserving what had been, of filling the hearth with something that could not rot. These glimpses, small and tender, reminded the villagers that even in the most terrible silence, not all had given in, that while some had bones, others had memories. And though the famine had rendered both equally fragile, the intentions behind them remained as far apart as fire and frost. But the presence of the bones changed the village in quiet, irrevocable ways. Trust, already thin, wore thinner still. The homes with marked doors became places no one walked near. The air around them seemed heavier. Children turned their heads when passing. The wind howled louder at their corners, as though even it wanted to leave those spaces behind. Still, life continued in the only way it could, slowly, with deliberate numbness. Fires, when they were made, burned short and without laughter. Meals, if they could be called that, were eaten alone. And the hearth, once the heart of the home, became merely stone again. Cold, quiet stone. But perhaps the most heartbreaking truth was this. Those who had placed the bones beneath the hearth had done so not out of fear or cruelty, but out of love. A parent unwilling to bury a child in the wet ground. A wife who could not bring herself to part from her husband's remains. A sibling who could not let go. And so, they had hidden them in the only sacred space left. The hearth, where once warmth had lived, where once stories had been told. The famine had stolen fire, but it had not stolen memory. And in that, perhaps, there was still something left to protect. To speak of salt during the famine was to invoke something nearly mythical, an object that once flavored soup and preserved meat, now more valuable than iron, more desired than gold. The villagers called the old merchant path that wound through the hills the salt road, though no merchant had traveled it in years. Its stones were cracked, its signs faded, and weeds had grown up where carts once rolled steady and loud. But in the third year of hunger, the salt road became something more than a trail. It became a rumor, a whisper, and for some, a temptation. They said there was a trader, no one knew his name, who still made the journey once every turning moon. He carried not flour or meat, not herbs or fruit, but salt. Great cloth sacks of it, stained from years of weather and blood. They said he asked no coin. That his price was something else. Something quieter. A lock of hair. A day's labor. A night of secrets. Or a child. No one had seen him. Not clearly. Only shapes in the fog. A bell that rang not with joy, but dread. Once, a boy named Emmer claimed he had glimpsed the cart at dawn. White sacks swaying like ghosts, wheels that didn't touch the ground. He had followed the trail into the trees and returned 3 days later, his eyes unfocused, his mouth unable to form words for weeks. He carried with him a small pouch tied with sinew. Inside was salt perfectly dry, enough to flavor a whole winter's worth of meals. If there had been meals, the village was torn. Some believed the salt road was cursed, that anyone who bartered with a faceless merchant had damned their soul, exchanging hunger for something worse. Others, especially those with children wasting away in the cold, saw no curse, only chance. If there truly was salt out there in the mist, then surely it could be traded for food, preserved for spring, used to stretch scraps into something survivable. But what was the price? No one knew for certain, and those who want to find out either never returned or returned in ways that made them strangers. One woman came back with salt-stiffened hands and a tongue that never spoke again. She had brought enough to share, and the villagers used it with trembling reverence. Sprinkled on rotted cabbage, rubbed into dried roots, stirred into water until it became broth in name only. And yet no one dared ask what she had given. Her children were gone. Some said they had died while she was away. Others said the price had been chosen before she left. Robart, with his silent tread and endless watchfulness, once traced the salt road by moonlight. He did not speak of what he saw, but when he returned, his cloak was soaked and torn, his face older than it had been when he left. He brought no salt, only a warning. Don't follow paths that answer before you ask. Still, there were some who could not resist. A father who had buried 3 children in one winter. A midwife who had nothing left to deliver. A boy who was too young to know that legends rarely offer what they promise. They followed the salt road, alone or in pairs, and when they returned, if they returned, there was always something different. Not always in the face. Sometimes in the walk. Sometimes in the eyes. And always in the silence that clung to them like wet cloth. Gilda, ever the keeper of broken rituals, began to place bowls of ash and salt on her doorstep each night. A protection, she said, not from the trader, but from the bargains made in desperation. Salt remembers, she whispered once. It soaks up sorrow. And too much sorrow in one place will cause something darker than hunger. In time, stories began to form. That the salt road was no longer a path through the hills, but a space between. That those who walked it were not walking the world, but slipping sideways into something else, something hungry, and that salt, once a gift from the earth, had become its own form of hunger, dry, white, and endless. And yet, in a village where boiled bark passed for dinner and moss was scraped from stone with knives, even cursed salt was welcome. One bag of it, half spilled in the mud, was enough to cause a scuffle that left 2 men dead. They had fought over who found it first. Neither had enough strength to bury the other. Their bodies were discovered days later, lying side by side, the spilled salt crusted around their mouths. The hollow bargain, as it came to be called, was not one trade, but many. A widow traded her wedding ring for a pouch that never emptied, until the night she gave it to a neighbor and it turned to dust. A crippled soldier gave up the memory of his name and walked the road whistling, never stopping, never sleeping. A mother gave her shadow, and afterward, no one could look her in the eye without shivering. Still, people went, not because they believed the salt would save them, but because the famine had emptied everything else. Hope, pride, belief, and only mystery remained. And sometimes, mystery was enough to keep walking, to step out into the mist, to look for the cart with its white sacks, to trade what little remained for one last taste of something real. In the village square, a child once asked Gilda why no one salted the snow to melt it. She looked at him for a long time, then said, "Because this snow is already made of sorrow." The child did not understand, but he remembered the answer. Years later, when the famine was a story told by those who had survived, he would recall that sentence more than any tale of the Salt Road, because in that moment, he had seen the grief behind the words. And perhaps that was a hollow bargain all along. Not the trade with the faceless merchant, not the exchange of soul for salt, but the bargain the village itself had made. To survive, they had given up the right to forget, and memory, once salted into bones, does not rot. It stays. It waits. It shapes. So even as the Salt Road faded again into obscurity, swallowed by moss and rain, its name remained. And whenever the wind howled a certain way, or when a traveler arrived with no name and clear eyes, the villagers would pause. They would check their doors. They would listen. And somewhere far off, where mist clings to stone and footsteps echo where no one walks, the cart rolls on. In a land where everything was once named, each stream, each stone, each gentle rise in the earth, a field without a name was an anomaly. It was more than just a patch of soil. It was a history lost. And yet, by the 3rd year of the famine, so many fields had fallen silent that the villagers no longer bothered to speak of them. They had not been taken by conquest or storm. No flags had changed. No armies had marched across their furrows. But they were gone all the same, swallowed by a hunger so deep that even the earth had stopped answering. The fields had once been the measure of time itself. Spring arrived when the first green showed. Summer was marked by golden waves ready for cutting. Autumn, a bustle of wagons and shouts. Winter only truly began when the last sheaf had been stacked high in the barn. These rhythms were not just habits. They were lifelines, rituals carved into the bones of generations. But in the 3rd year, the fields gave no signs. The wind moved over them like it moved across stone. Nothing rustled. Nothing stirred. It was said quietly that the fields had forgotten their names. Not in the way a person forgets, through age or distraction, but in the way something gives up being. As if the land no longer fed, no longer loved, no longer walked with the respectful footfall of planters and tillers, had decided to let go, and in doing so, had erased its own memory. Crops did not grow. Even weeds refused to root. Seeds vanished into the earth, as if into mouths too hungry to give anything back. Robart, ever the silent witness, continued to walk his plot each morning. It had once been a thriving quarter-acre, terraced carefully down the hill, bordered by stones he'd placed with his father as a boy. Now it was just dirt, cracked, gray, indifferent. He did not plan anymore, but he walked, as if his presence alone might remind the earth of its purpose. He would stop at the edges, look down at the valley, and murmur to no one in particular, "Still here." Whether he was speaking to the land or himself, no one knew. The younger ones, those born during the hunger, had never seen a green field. They could not imagine wheat. The word meant nothing. Grain was a concept, not a memory. They knew food as broth from boiled bark, as lumps of soaked acorns pressed into cakes that burned more smoke than flavor. And so, When the elders spoke of harvests that stretched into festivals, of days when whole families sang while sighs danced through gold, the children would sit wide-eyed, like listening to tales of magic. I used to smell the earth and know if the potatoes were coming. Old Harn would mutter, running fingers over the scarred handle of a hoe that had not touched soil in years. Could tell by the bend of the sun, by how the worms moved. But now, he would trail off, eyes fixed on nothing, the words drying up like everything else. It wasn't that the fields were barren. It was that they had forgotten how to yield. Even when spring came, late and reluctant, nothing broke through the crust. And when villagers tried, scratching at the ground with fingers, with rusted tools, with hope, they found only silence. Seeds rotted where they fell, roots twisted and shrank, curling in on themselves as if rejecting the light. It was not illness. It was absence. Gilda, keeper of the old names, once tried to bless a field. She brought her herbs, her whispered charms, her bowls of salt and ash. She walked the furrows in long, deliberate loops, singing songs too old to remember clearly. But when she finished, when the final string of nettle had been tied around the final stake, she knelt and wept, not for what had failed to grow, but for what had vanished. Even the soil forgets, she said, to no one but the wind. And so the village stopped naming them. Fields once known as Bear's Rise, Widow's Trough, Ember Hollow were simply the far side, or that place by the bend. Names faded like the footprints of the workers who once danced among the crops. With no names came no visits. With no visits, no prayers. And with no prayers, the last tether between land and people was severed. But it was not just the crops that faded. The very feel of the land changed. The earth, once soft with spring mud, or warm beneath bare feet in summer, turned strange, hard in places it should not have been, when in places untouched by rain. The worms disappeared. The birds, too. The hedges grew wild and then died without flowering. And at night, those who walked too close swore the silence hummed, not with life, but with memory, as though the land itself mourned what it once was. Robart found something one morning, a sprout, just a sliver of green, no longer than his thumbnail, poking through near a stone where he had once buried carrot seeds. He said nothing. He knelt, stared, breathed on it, did not touch it, returned each day. For 3 days it grew. On the 4th, it was gone. A rabbit, perhaps, or the cold, or maybe it had never been there. Maybe his mind had offered it as a kindness, a false bloom. And yet, stories began to spread of other small signs. A wildflower blooming where no root had taken hold in years. A berry bush showing one single red pearl. A patch of grass soft enough to lie in. And though these sightings were rare and often contradicted by others, they offer strange kind of hope. Not that the famine was ending, but that the land had not fully given up. Children began to draw fields, not as they were now, but as they might be again. Crude pictures in soot and chalk, scratched onto walls and stones. Curving hills, rows of green, people with baskets. The images spread, not as prophecy, but as memory in reverse, an attempt to remind the land, perhaps, of what it had once been. Because in the 3rd year, it was not just stomachs that were empty. It was language, ritual, connection, and in that emptiness, even the fields, themselves mute witnesses to so many lifetimes, have forgotten how to be fields. But names are a strange thing. They vanish quickly, but they also return quietly, like moss creeping back across stone. One day, near the cottage where Anna still sketched food on scraps of wood, a child pointed to a patch of land and asked, "What's that place called?" And for the first time in many months, someone answered, not with certainty, not with pride, but with memory. Sunhill, they said, slowly, used to be called Sunhill. And just like that, the land listened again. By the 3rd winter, the famine had ceased to be a storm and become a season. It no longer roared or struck. It simply remained, settled deep into the bones of the village, like cold in a stone wall or mildew in a thatched roof. It clung quietly to every surface, every breath. People no longer asked when it might end, or even if. The hunger had become part of life's rhythm. Something endured, Managed, named only in the subtlest of ways. It was the silence between bites. The wave voices faltered when the wind shifted. The shared, unspoken knowledge that not everyone would be here in the spring. And so the famine, without ceremony or violence, began to gather its final harvest. But this was not a harvest of wheat or barley, of fruits plucked in celebration, or vegetables lifted from dark soil in gratitude. This was hunger's harvest. And it came gently, almost respectfully. No scythes swung. No barns were filled. The dead did not fall in heaps. They faded, like the morning fog, slowly, softly, and without protest. Old Harn was the first to go. He was found sitting on his stool by the empty field, back straight, hands resting on his knees, as though waiting for something to rise from the dirt. His hoe lay nearby, rusted and cold. There were no signs of struggle, no hunger etched into his face. Just peace, as if he had simply chosen not to wake up. They buried him with the tool he had carried longer than his own shadow. Gilda, standing over the patch of disturbed soil, said he waited long enough. No one asked what she meant. Others followed, not with cries or scenes, but in stillness. One by one, beds were left unoccupied. Bowls remained untouched. Voices that once murmured in the dusk no longer stirred. A child fell asleep in her brother's lap and never rose. A midwife laid down her apron and simply walked into the woods. Her shoes were found, dry and neat, placed side by the old chapel wall, as if she had stepped out of them and into another world entirely. It was a kind of death that doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't knock or announce itself. It waits until the soul, worn smooth and hollow, opens a door on its own. There were no plagues, no wounds, no dramatic collapses in the mud. Just empty chairs. Just quiet. And still, life tried to continue. Meals, such as they were, still passed from hand to hand. The children still drew things on walls. Robart still walked the edge of the village as if checking its pulse. And Gilda still lit her small candle each night in the chapel, though the wax was down to its final finger's length. They were not living, not truly, but they were holding on, as if each breath might tether them to something beyond this. It was during this time that the village began to mark the door frames with bits of twine, knotted 3 times. No one explained why, perhaps to signify who still lived there, or maybe as a talisman against being forgotten. The wind tugged at them, unspooling some, knotting others tighter. But the people noticed. They checked. They counted knots the way they once counted chickens or sacks of grain. The hunger had taken bodies, yes, but it had also harvested something harder to name. Memory, joy, the strange, effortless laughter that used to come from nowhere. That was gone. Even when small moment of kindness returned, a crust shared, a story whispered. They came out of necessity, not habit. Life had shrunk down to its narrowest shape. Survival wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about enduring. In the 3rd December, it snowed. The snow had been absent the previous years, as if even the sky had forgotten how to soften things. But this year it fell in sheets thick and silent, coating everything in white. The roofs, the fields, the trees, once so desperate and dry, were made beautiful again, clean, untouched. For a single night, the village looked like a place that had never known hunger. The children stepped outside and turned their faces upward. Some smiled, some cried. No one spoke. But when the sun rose and the snow began to melt, it revealed not life beneath, but emptiness. Tracks led nowhere. Footprints ended in collapse. A single glove curled beside a door. A rat, dead and untouched. The beauty had been brief, a curtain drawn over a wound. Now it sagged again. Robart, standing in the square, looked at the snow melting in thick, brown rivulets and whispered, "This is what mercy looks like now." No one asked what he meant. Yet hunger's quiet harvest did something the loudness never could. It gave people the strange space to remember, as if in these final days, when there was nothing left to gather, the mind turned inward, toward spring feasts of long ago, the smell of honey bread, the laughter of someone no longer here, the sun rising over fields that still had names. It hurt, these memories. But they were also a kind of food, not for the body, for something deeper. Aneth, in her quiet room, drew a loaf of bread larger than her arms. She colored it with crushed roots and marked it with a cross. "For the ones who come after," she whispered, and pinned it to the wall. And they came, slowly, the ones who had left before the famine, returning with sacks on their backs. The traders, cautious but curious, testing the roads again. A new priest, young and wide-eyed, stepping into the ruined chapel with a candle and a question. "Does anything still grow here?" The villagers didn't answer at first, but one of them, Robart, Gilda, or maybe a child no one noticed, pointed to the edge of the field where a small, defiant sprout poked up through the frozen crust. Just one. It was not much. It was not enough, but it was a beginning. And as the wind curled once more around broken stones and abandoned doorways, it carried not just the sorrow of what had been lost, but the memory of survival, not of triumph, not of healing, just a breath. The rains returned with a whisper, not a roar. There was no storm, no thunder to announce the change, just a gentle patter on the rooftops one evening, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to fall. At first, no one noticed. The sound was too soft, too timid, like a memory brushing against the edge of sleep. But when the morning came and the village awoke to the scent of damp earth, the scent of something almost like life, people stepped out of their homes and looked to the sky, not in joy, not in relief, but with cautious disbelief. For the first time in many months, the wind did not carry only dust. It carried petrichor, that faint, sacred smell of rain touching soil, of thirst-meeting balm. It was not warm, not yet. It was a cold rain, the kind that seeps into bones, but it was clean. It trickled down walls, gathered in broken buckets, and softened the edges of stone. It flowed in thin, uncertain streams down the cart paths and pooled in the empty furrows of the fields. And in its slow journey through the village, the rain began to speak, not in words, but in memories. Where it touched the earth, it stirred stories. At the foot of Robart's old field, where no seeds had grown in 3 years, the water settled into the places where furrows used to be. Though the earth remained cracked and sullen, the rain followed the ghost of cultivation. It remembered. It moved not randomly, but in lines, as if tracing something it had once known. And for those who stood watching, it felt like a whisper from a time before hunger, a silent echo of routine, of purpose. Children, too young to remember real crops, splashed in the puddles that gathered near their doorsteps. Their laughter, thin and unfamiliar, rose into morning like birdsong in a forest long emptied. And while the adults did not join them, they watched quietly, some with tears that mingled with the drizzle. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the closest thing they'd felt to warmth in months. Anna sat by the open window, a wet scrap of cloth catching drops from the thatch above. She dipped her fingers into the rainwater and drew new shapes. Circles this time, not food. The rain, she decided, did not taste like sorrow. It tasted like silence broken, like a lullaby hummed from far away. Gilda, ever the weaver of old beliefs, placed a bowl outside her door and watched it fill. When it reached the rim, she poured it out at the edge of the chapel grounds and whispered, "For what you took and for what you might return." No one asked whom she was speaking to. The rain seemed to understand. But the rain did not come without its weight. It reminded people not only of life, but of everything that had been lost. Water rolled down the sides of abandoned cottages and soaked into graves with no markers. It slipped through holes in roofs that had not been repaired because no one lived beneath them. And in some corners, the water revealed what the drought had hidden. Bones rising to the softening soil, old rotten forgotten corners, doors that swelled shut under their own grief. It was the kind of rain that uncovers. In one part of the village where the old bakery once stood, the rain washed away the last of the soot-blackened walls, revealing behind them the faint trace of a mural, painted long ago in ochres and browns. It was faded and fractured, but the image was clear enough. People gathered around a loaf, smiling, sharing, a feast. The rain trickled down their painted faces, as if crying for them. Robart stood before it for a long time. When he finally moved, he did not speak. But later that night, he lit a fire for the first time in weeks. It burned low, barely more than a flicker, but it was flame. He sat beside it and let the heat press gently against his skin. And when the rain began to tap again on the roof, he did not flinch. The rain came for 3 days and 3 nights. It did not flood nor roar. It did not cleanse, but neither did it destroy. It simply fell, patient, consistent, determined, like a story waiting to be heard. And in its quiet persistence, it softened not just the ground, but the silence between people. Words returned. Small ones, simple ones, still here, a bit warmer. It smells like spring. And when the 4th day dawned with clouds breaking into light, people gathered, not for a meeting, not for a prayer, but simply to be together. They stood in the square, said little, looked at the damp soil, felt the weight of their limbs, still here, still tired, but moving, breathing, witnessing. No one danced, no one sang, but in their stillness was a kind of communion, as if the village itself had inhaled, for the first time in years. The rains, it seemed, had not come to heal. They had come to remember the pattern of life, the way roots search deep, the way the earth opens when it's ready, the way sorrow, even when silent, soaks through everything. And the villagers, still gaunt, still haunted, listened to that memory, not with joy, not with celebration, but with a kind of sacred, fragile recognition that even the sky had missed them. The earth, they said, had been deaf to the seeds. That was the way Gilda explained it one morning, standing in the softened field near the chapel, her hands caked with mud, not from planting, but from simply feeling the ground again. "We've been talking," she said softly, brushing away a strand of gray hair, but the earth she forgot how to hear. And indeed, for 3 long years, the villagers had offered seeds to the soil like prayers dropped into silence. No shoots, no sprouts, no answer. Only the same cracked, in different crust. But now, something had shifted, not loudly, not obviously, but gently in the smallest places first. It began not with a harvest, but with a murmur. A child, poking the ground with a stick, uncovered a sprout she thought was a weed. But her grandmother looked closer and gasped, not in fear, but in awe. It was not a weed. It was a bean, one they had planted the previous year and long since forgotten. Somehow impossibly it had waited, had held on to the memory of growth through frost, drought, and famine. Now it had heard the rain. It had remembered. Word of the sprout spread not like gossip, but like breath in winter, visible for a moment, then gone, but known. People came in small groups to look, not to touch. They knelt around it as though it were an infant born to a barren land. They whispered. They did not name it, fearing that names might scare it away. They watched the way its tiny leaves reached upward, soft and trembling, not as if it were weak, but as if the sun might be a stranger to whom it must be reintroduced. Encouraged, someone planted 3 more beans near it, not in rows, just scattered, carefully, reverently. They did not water them. There was still fear in that kind of hope, but they watched, they waited, and within days, 2 had emerged. The 3rd never did. And somehow, that made it more real, as if even in rebirth, the earth required patience, sacrifice, limits. Gilda began walking the fields again, not to bless them, not to chant over them, but to listen. She carried no tools, only a small wooden bowl in which she placed any sprout she found growing wild, clover, grass, some that might be turnip. "The seeds," she said quietly to Robart one morning. "They're remembering their instructions." To which he replied, after a long pause, "Or maybe we're just learning how to speak gently again." It was not just in the fields. In the cracks of the chapel steps, moss began to creep, lush green, defiant. On the north-facing wall of the bakery ruins, nettles appeared, harsh, stinging things but alive. Gilda brewed them into tea, her hands red and sore, her smile faint but real. "Nettles bitter," she said to the gathered villagers one gray morning. "But bitterness wakes the tongue." People began digging, not to till, but to test. The soil was still lean, still pale, but in some places, when turned with care, it crumbled softly, releasing the scent of long-buried richness. Worms returned, few and thin, but there. Rain puddled for a time before seeping down. which meant the earth was no longer rejecting it. And when someone discovered an old sack of barley seeds, sealed and forgotten in the loft of the tannery, there was silence, not because they expected it to grow, but because they dared to try. The planting of those seeds was not a festival. There were no drums, no garlands, no song. Only hands and dirt, eyes downcast, mouths closed. Each seed was placed as one might lay a letter on a grave, carefully, trembling, with more sorrow than hope. And when it was done, they did not wait beside the furrows. They left them alone, as if the seeds, like people, needed space to feel safe again. Days passed, then weeks. The field stayed mostly still. But then one evening, as twilight blurred the edges of the world, someone saw a green shimmer along the edge of Sunhill. The first field to be named again. Not rows, not uniform, but growth. People came, slowly. They did not shout. They did not cry. But some knelt, not to dig, but to press their ears against the earth, as if trying to hear the heartbeat beneath. Others placed their palms flat on the soil, whispering names of things they remembered. Radish, barley, sage, mint, hoping the soil might recognize them. Anna drew pictures again, this time of rose, of sun overhead, of a basket held in her own small hands. She pinned them to the chapel's wall, beneath the mural that rain had revealed. And for the first time in over a year, someone added to it, a child perhaps, a simple sketch of a stalk of wheat, almost crude, but it remained. No one washed it away. The seeds, it seemed, were not just listening. They were answering, quietly, cautiously, but undeniably. Not every planting took. Many furrows remained empty, and the sprouts that rose were delicate, unsure. But they grew, and with them, something else rose. Not hope, that was still too large a word, but expectation, curiosity, the beginnings of a return not to what had been, but to what might be again. Robart placed a single stone at the edge of the growing patch, then another and another, until they formed a small circle around the most promising stalk. "This," he said to no one, "is where I'll wait." And each morning he sat beside it, speaking softly, not prayers, not stories, just sound, so the seed would not feel alone. When Gilda passed by, she did not interrupt. But later, as she lit her candle in the chapel, she murmured, "He's teaching it to stay." And that was the truth of it. The famine was not over, but neither was it absolute. Something had shifted. The earth was not healed, but it was listening. The seeds were not thriving, but they were no longer silent. And in that fragile, trembling space between hunger and harvest, between forgetting and remembering, the villagers waited, not with empty hands, but with open ones. Spring arrived late that year, not with fanfare or fragrance, but with a breath that was only slightly less cold. The sun, still pale and cautious, stretched across the hills a little longer each day, but it did not yet warm the bones. The earth was tender and unsure. Shoots emerged slowly, uncertain of their place in a world still learning how to live again. Yet the people, worn and weathered, met this hesitant spring with a silence that had nothing to do with despair, and everything to do with reverence. The famine, by now, was no longer a visitor. It had become part of the village. It lingered, not as starvation, but as memory, not in the absence of food, but in the way meals were taken, slowly, carefully, with heads bowed, not in prayer, but in awareness. The hunger was no longer gnawing at their ribs. It had moved deeper, into the mind, into the rhythm of life. It taught them to measure, to wait, to count not just what was eaten, but what was shared. And above all, it taught them what could be lost. There were sprouts now, real ones, rows of beans and barley beginning to line Sunhill and Ember Hollow. Names were returning, whispered at first, then spoken aloud. The fields were not green, at least not yet, but they were alive. And where once only morning had passed between homes, now came the faint echoes of preparation. Tools sharpened, sacks mended, a basket being weaved again, slowly, carefully, by hands that had forgotten how to braid. Still, No one said the famine was over. They didn't need to, because even as food returned in hints and gestures, the hunger stayed, not in the belly, but in the way the people looked at the earth, in the way they stood when they listened, in how they never, ever left a crust uneaten. They had been emptied too long to ever truly be full again. Robart, thinner than he had ever been, still walked his path each morning. But now, instead of pacing in search of signs, he carried a sack. Inside it, seeds Flynn in a small loaf always halved, one part for eating, one for giving. Still here, he whispered to each tree, each stone. Still here. Gilda's hands trembled more now, but her fire burned steady. She spoke less often, but when she did, people listened with the quiet attention one gives to the final log in the hearth. "The land is listening," she said once, her voice a thread. "But we must remember how to answer." Children born during the hunger began to ask questions, not about what was, but what could be. They had never known feast, only famine, and yet they sketched orchards, danced around stumps as if they were trees, and played at planting with pockets full of pebbles. They had inherited not the loss, but the longing, and in that longing was possibility. Aneth drew again. Her pictures changed. No longer were they only of food or rain. Now she painted people, eating, holding hands, carrying water, sleeping beneath stars, living. Her walls filled not with fantasy, but with memory imagined forward, what might be if the land remained kind. Still, some houses stayed empty, not all returned, and the church bells, when rung again for the first time, sounded different, as if their hollows remembered what silence had filled them. They did not toll with celebration. They sang with grief and grace, a mourning for what had passed, a welcoming of what remained. The hunger did not disappear. It changed. It became wisdom. It became caution. It became the space between bites, the pause before a blessing, the way a hand reaches to share without being asked. It became a part of the village, not feared, not invited, but acknowledged. A guest who once overstayed, now lingering only in the stories told beside new fires. One night, as the stars returned, clear and sharp over roofs mended with patience and quiet hands, the villagers gathered, not for ritual, not for prayer, just to sit. Robart passed around a crust of bread. Gilda poured tea made from nettle and something that might have been mint. No one said a word about the hunger, but every hand accepted the offering. And in that circle, lit by nothing but starlight and the glow of memory, they knew the truth. Hunger leaves marks you do not see. On the skin, perhaps, it fades. But in the way you plant, in the way you eat, in how you hold your children close at night, even there it lives. They were no longer starving, but they would never be the same. And in that final truth, they found something deeper than fullness. They found meaning, not in the feast, but in the waiting, in the silence, in the rain, in the seed. And as the first real spring in years broke across the valley, the hunger remained, not as a wound, but as a whisper, a reminder of how close life lives to loss, and how sometimes even the smallest seed is enough to begin again. And so, the story fades not with conclusion, but with quiet. The fields lie still beneath stars that once watched over famine and silence. The winds that once carried sorrow now drift gently, carrying only memory. The seeds rest, the hunger lingers, but softer now, like a shadow that no longer frightens. There is no great ending, just breath, just a slow turning of seasons and the knowledge that life, even in its most fragile form, can continue. Let the stillness carry you now. Let the quiet echo a little longer. Let the weight of the world slip softly from your shoulders. And if your eyes are closed, stay there. The past is behind us. The night is yours now. Sleep well.